Hello and welcome to an episode, I've lost count of which number it is, of some sort of podcast. It could be PolitFlix, depending on whether it ever gets uploaded by editorial. If it isn't PolitFlix, the name, the format, etc. to be confirmed. Names include possible names, the franchise guys, the Cafe and Florence cast, anything, and suggestions welcome. But we'll assume that the formula is the same. So it's me, James Murphy, known to some readers as the editor at Movie Viral. And I have with me Dave Bond, and I will bring Dave in a second. Our theme for today, obviously aside from the usual introductory chat about movie news and other items in the news, before we sort of move into the filmic focus of it, is Tony Blair and the common themes that come out of his era as Labour leader and Prime Minister, his legacy, and his current standing, and how there is a specific set of movies that we're going to look at, which takes us through various stages of that career, which are directed mostly by Stephen Frears, all star Michael Sheen, and are all written by Peter Morgan. And as a backup to that, as sort of a postscript, we're going to look a little bit as well at a Roman Polanski film called The Ghostwriter, which has Pierce Brosnan playing a very thinly disguised take on Tony Blair. Okay, so Dave, how are you? You alright?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks. I've watched all of these within about the last 36 hours, so hopefully I'm reasonably fresh on the details.
Yeah, and it need not be the details; it can just be the general impression. Because I think certainly, you know, that they're movie experiences, even if you're not a fan of politics. I mean, obviously less so with I think The Deal and The Special Relationship, but The Queen, which is the middle one, is very much I think a self-contained piece of film. You don't need to be interested in the details of it, and then of course, you know, it's a character piece, if you like, which is still of interest. We start off with some news. The big one was, certainly in terms of film news, Star Wars have done it again. What are they doing? Do you think there's a conspiracy? Are they deliberately hiring directors and then just seeing how far they can push, get away with it, and then maybe Kathleen Kennedy just having a bit of a laugh?
Well, let's put all these things in perspective, because Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall produced the last film we're going to cover today. I didn't notice till I watched it again this time, but The Ghost or Ghostwriter, depending on which territory you saw it in, is a Kennedy Marshall production. They've been producers for many years, produced lots of things we all know, and they don't have a noted track record of falling out with directors that I'm aware of. I think what's happened in this case is quite simply, I think it's the choices they've made. I think it's just flawed choices at the start, and I think it's possibly from a desire to have fresh voices.
Yeah.
To have fresh voices into the franchise. I mean, they started with J.J. Abrams, which makes complete sense, because J.J. Abrams is a safe pair of hands and a very, very good mimic. So if you say, well, we need you to sort of mimic the style of what's come before and take it on a little bit, he's a very safe pair of hands. But then they were hiring people like Josh Trank. Well, Josh Trank had a very limited track record. He made a film called, I'm totally blanking on his name, Chronicle. Chronicle was a sort of found footage film long after that format got tired. But it was about like some teenagers, including Dane DeHaan, who sort of started to develop superpowers effectively. And there were a couple of very, very good things about that film. But it was a $13 million film. It was low budget by any measure. And you also had a found footage aspect to it. So the thing is, that can cover a multitude of sins in whatever directing talent you do or don't have. So he's hired to do a Star Wars film whilst he's still making the Fantastic Four. And of course that ended up being a disaster, and then all sorts of stories came out of the set as to his behaviour generally. Lord and Miller, you can see why they go for Lord and Miller. 21 Jump Street, the Lego Batman movie, and other things. But it's easy to be wise after the event. After the event, I look at it and go, well, why would you hire them? Their sensibility's all wrong. It's way, way, way too comedic. And that is effectively what happened. Their sensibility was all wrong for it. And then with Colin Trevorrow, it's only rumour at this stage, but the rumour at this stage was his ego was out of control as well. And in the midst of trying to put this film together, his previous film comes out bombs and has horrific word of mouth.
Yeah.
So I just think it's a very, very unfortunate run, and I think it's still too early, despite how many that they've had now, to say, well, there's something wrong, something's amiss there. I just think they made some choices that were, in some respects, relatively brave, and they haven't really paid off as you've got into it, as evidenced by the fact they replaced Lord and Miller with Ron Howard, and there just isn't a safer pair of hands than Ron Howard.
Yeah, no, you'd let him drive your kid home after a sixth form dance. That's how I think of Ron Howard. He's sort of I don't know. He probably likes. I think a bad day for him is he wears the wrong jumper. He's a very wholesome craftsman. He's not going to set the world on fire with a particular vision, because by his own admission, I think that's not what he's about. But this is a man who has experimented, I think, in pretty much every genre there is. He does not have an identifiable style, so he is adaptable. He's a very good manager. He's a very good leader of people. And I think he has excellent, likable people skills, which these people forget that it's a business and it's a corporate entity, and all we get as film fans is the product of that. We see, obviously, what gets released. We hear the tittle-tattle, the gossip, which obviously has to grow itself in the clickbait era. Unfortunately, these are pretty. I mean, they seem, I think, like far more disastrous or major events than they are, and partly because people are just so desperate for news about these projects. They make the story grow and grow when it doesn't need to. In the scheme of things,
some people are determined to hate this new universe anyway, because it's big corporate Disney and all the rest.
Yeah, even though they're the very people who want more of it.
I mean, I can understand to a degree, but I think there is a danger. I'm trying to think which director it was that said this, but he was saying how hard it is to stay likeable in that business. That you start believing your own hype, and when you think they hired Josh Trank just as he got a big franchise, or hopefully a franchise starter. They hired Colin Trevorrow off the back of Jurassic World, which was a huge hit. And I think that they've just got a bunch of guys that have come in and started talking like they have Final Cut, and you're never going to have Final Cut in a Star Wars film. It's like the Bond universe. It's a producer-led series.
Well, actually, and it's funny you should mention that, because, I mean, not just because they're women, but maybe just in terms of presentational style. Kathleen Kennedy and Barbara Broccoli, for some reason in my head, are not dissimilar in the sense that, I mean, with the Bond product, obviously, they have a lot more time to look at their options. What people forget about Kathleen Kennedy, by contrast, is that she is having to manage the whole thing. That's her job. And the hiring and firing of a director, be it midway through a project, like Lord and Miller, or before it's taken off with Trevorrow, is only one very small part. It's sadly the part that has been reported. Well, what they're forgetting is that this lady has piloted something here that is a new business model. And as you very rightly pointed out at the beginning, this is somebody who has a pretty flawless track record of maintaining good relationships with people who are notoriously, although they're quite nice guys, I suspect, people like Spielberg and so on, they're also quite ruthless business people. So if this was somebody who wasn't competent, she would not be in the job that she is. And the level of bitching that has gone on in the fan community about her, and indeed about Trevorrow, I mean, because the fact is, we don't know what the full story is. He may have had a breakdown. He may have a sick relative. He may have had an off day and told people to piss off. He may just think, do you know what? I'm not happy with the tone now that Carrie Fisher has died. Because one of the things, I think it was John Campia who pointed this out on his podcast, And he's another lovely success story in podcasting because he's just broken off from, we're talking about corporate management, Collider Videos, which is also excellent. But he was very much the heart and soul of it. He broke off from them briefly last year, and now he's broken off completely because I think there was he just wanted a bit more creative freedom, and he will end up probably being his own corporate boss eventually, as happens, even happened with George Lucas or Citizen Kane or whatever story you want to go with in that. But he pointed out that, look, Trevorrow was hired to very possibly direct a completely different vision because they were developing it while Carrie was still alive, and we have no idea what the shape of the resolution is on that and how fundamentally it may have changed the structure of the story, the beats, the tone. And they may genuinely have come to a point where he said, look, I can't direct a movie in which maybe the resolution to this isn't as I see it. And I think John Campion made a good point, which is, why not just recast the role? It would be sacrilegious to some Star Wars fans, but as he's pointing out, Carrie Fisher was many things in terms of creative and, skeptical about certain elements of the business, but she wasn't, she didn't revere herself or her own contribution to things. She was actually quite kind of, I think playful with that imagery. And I think she would have been perfectly happy. I can't obviously speak for her, God rest her soul, but I don't think she would have had a massive problem if the story arc of Princess Leia and the structure of the new trilogy required a recast. With a recast, someone like Meryl Streep or whoever.
I think we've got well ahead of ourselves there.
Have we?
Let's take a step back for a
right.
second.
That's
yes,
me.
Because at the point where he was hired, Rian Johnson hadn't even started filming episode 8 yet.
Right.
And Carrie Fisher was still alive. As you rightly point out, you might well be right with all of that, by the way. I'm not putting doing it.
Well, we'll never know.
We'll
never know.
It's more the fact that he would have had to have started developing the film before The Last Jedi even started shooting.
Yeah.
So there's always a movable feast. He will have had to be in constant conversation with Rian Johnson about it.
Yeah.
And then, yes, it might well have been the Carrie Fisher aspect, but what I'm saying is, it's relatively rare now that filmmakers are hired before the previous installment even goes before principal photography.
Yep.
So that's the problem. You've got a settled base to work on with a film. You know, when you think of something, if you think like a Bond film, if you ever want to follow on from the last one, Quantum of Solace was a terrible example because of the writer's strike, and they did rush it. But at the point where they went before cameras, Casino Royale was complete. It was out there. Everyone knew what happened in it. It was a settled part of the Bond universe. So you've got a settled base to work on. Colin Trevorrow won't have had that until very, very recently. And in fact, the film is probably in some degree in post-production even now. The Last Jedi. I doubt it's locked and loaded. We've got 3 months left to go. So I think it's always going to be difficult. And when you look at Kathleen Kennedy, who you were right to say, well, we both said doesn't have a particularly bad track record of falling out with people that we know of, she's got to manage the run-up now to The Last Jedi, final cut, everything that goes with that, any issues with it, everything to do with the sort of worldwide junket that's now got to happen to promote it. You've got the Han Solo film being effectively reshot, and she's got to supervise that. You've got pre-production underway on episode 9, and she's now got to find another director. And we'll have pre-production underway, pre-production, if you like, underway on whatever the anthology story is going to be after episode 9, because that's only about 18 months away.
Yeah.
Because episode 9, that's a big if. It could be pushed now with the change of director, but it was meant to come out May 19th, and then they were going to go back to May. Yeah. So you were going to have May 19, May 2020. We are due another Star Wars story, if you like, not a main chapter. So Kathleen Kennedy is currently working on 4 different Star Wars films, as well as trying to plan whatever the next main trilogy is going to be. Because episode 9, they should have pretty much a complete idea now of what it's going to look like, and therefore what Star Wars looks like at the end of the current trilogy.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a workload. and it's going to lead to creative tensions, surely. And if you then add the degree of calling in relatively unseasoned directors who think, who all think their shit don't stink because they literally just hit it big, then you're going to have this issue.
Yeah. I mean, it is a tightrope. As I say, I mean, my instinct is that it probably was, as they put out in the statement, probably quite amicable, and far less dramatic than some people would have it. I do think it's kind of funny that if looking at sort of particularly the Facebook pitter patter about it, and there was an army of people saying, "Good, he's a hack," and I'm kind of thinking, okay, that's fine. I have a quick look at browse across their profile, and you see, their friend list or whatever. And you see on their friend list includes, very possibly, I'm not naming names here, but very possibly includes Colin Trevorrow. Now, I'm not saying by any means that that's necessarily the real Trevorrow, although it is, or that he assiduously is sat down checking his Facebook. Let's face it, if he were that sort of a guy, he probably wouldn't have been this big a director in the first place, but there you have it. I do know this. I think that's slightly bad form on the part of certain people who call themselves fans. I also know this. I sent Trevor, I can't remember whether it's Twitter or Facebook, but it was certainly him and it was certainly official, a message shortly after I'd seen Jurassic World and I was satisfied with it. I enjoyed it. A little bit like the Ron Howard factor. I didn't think it was, world defining or kind of particularly innovative, but it was an enjoyable action adventure piece that managed to extend.
That's not what you're there to do if you're bringing back a franchise.
Yeah, but I kind of thought, it was serviceable for what it was, and it was, frankly, even though I think Joe Johnston is a good director, it was better than what Joe Johnston managed with Jurassic Park 3, in the sense that it had actually expanded rather than reduced the possibilities with that universe, and it had managed to take out of what had been nearly, I think, best part of a 14-year just slump in terms of ideas with that franchise. They'd been trying to develop a fourth Jurassic Park for ages, and some of the scripts that were leaked online, I think quite deliberately, were just bafflingly poor in terms of conception and pitch and everything. So to get it back to that simplicity and to execute that was, to my mind, an achievement. And without sounding patronising about it, I think I put that in a message to him. And I said, look, I know you're already working on a sequel. You might want to consider a reread of certain bits of Crichton that haven't been used. Not that that hadn't occurred to him. This is me a couple of years ago. I've learned a lot since then. But he replied, and he was very nice about it. Another director who did that to me recently was Kevin Feige after Ghostbusters, because I think I'm the only person in the world who actually gave that film a nice review, and I was nice about it. I mean, I did highlight that it did have flaws, but I was also saying, look, as a film in itself, it's nice. Yeah. And he was maybe because I was the only person saying something nice, but he took the time to send a message back. Now, the reason I know that these are, I mean, okay, it could be someone in either director's team rather than the person itself, but it's a validated account and so on. So a message like that, however brief, is, to my mind, even a small reflection on the person. And, I'm not saying I'm the best judge of character in the world. I'm still quite naive on that front sometimes. But I do think that little indications like that, to me, don't seem to coincide with the idea of somebody who is a petulant egomaniac throwing their weight around.
No, and even if they are, we all have very slightly different work personas anyway.
Yeah.
But just on top of that, it's dealing with a level of stress that most of us don't deal with in our everyday jobs. And as much as you might say, oh, nurses and firefighters, yeah, how cliched that is, but true, I suppose.
Well, it's a different sort of work. It's a different focus, because I think the thing about
you're dealing with how big a budget.
Yeah.
You are spearheading how. There are a lot of people who can find themselves out of work if you get it wrong. Studios have gone bust on the back of big flops. It's really stressful stuff. I'm not particularly defending the directors in that we don't know what's happened, but at the same time, the very fact we don't know what happens says, shut up.
Yeah.
If you didn't like Jurassic World, then fine. But we've got all these expert opinions on who it should be now. And they're bullshit, because there's people who've got no idea how any of this works, or any of the relationships in the industry anyway. The other day, someone said Spielberg. Well, brilliant. He's due an Indiana Jones film about 6 months afterwards.
And I don't think he'd do it anyway, out of loyalty to George.
No, he wouldn't. He wouldn't. But even if he went sod it, I've already wanted to. I've always wanted to. I've heard people say Denis Villeneuve. Well, that's great, but he's now got how many months of promotion to do on Blade Runner, and then he goes straight into adapting Dune.
Yeah.
You know, it's just they know better than us.
Yeah.
They just do.
Yeah.
Ryan Johnson's a very, very good choice. A lot of people said, well, let Ryan Johnson do it. Well, again, we don't know quite how the logistics of how this is going to work. Is Ryan Johnson in any position to do pre-production and filming on 9 while he's still wrapping 8?
That would have made sense if they'd hired him to do that from day one. But they didn't,
Yeah.
So, you know. And I think the other thing is, you know, it's nice to have variety. It's nice to have a different vision for the next one. Slightly. You know, because, I mean, George Lucas doing all 3 of the prequels is one of the reasons that 3 prequels don't particularly work well. This was the guy who, you know, had outsourced that for Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, which was his initial plan, I believe, with the prequels, was to get other directors in, but he changed part.
He had a good time filming. He had a good time making the first one.
Right.
That's what
That's
I heard.
good. Yeah, well, that's nice enough. But yeah, I think, I mean, I think whoever they get, it's going to be...
They don't owe us anything, James, you know? That's the thing. It's, you know, I've read a lot of hatred between Kathleen Kennedy's way in the last few days. And to be honest, it's split 50-50 with thank God, because Trevor Rose is a twat anyway. But even that's like a backhanded insult towards Kennedy because you hired him in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's always the way that, you know, if it's a strong woman, she has to be a cold-hearted bitch in people's eyes, rather than just somebody doing an extremely difficult job. And it's led to like this retcon of the whole universe is an abortion now. That, you know, you hired J.J. Abrams. Well, that's what you do when you need a safe pair of hands after he's been away for 12 years.
Yep.
And the 3 films that preceded that were not popular.
Yeah.
There hasn't been a universally loved Star Wars film for 37 years at this point. You know, 35 at the time of releasing it. You do bring it back, and you bring it back in a safe and reassuring fashion, in the same way as GoldenEye was for the Bond series, in the same way as Jurassic World was for Jurassic Park. It wasn't there to innovate.
Yep.
It was there to reassure.
Well, he's. I mean, look, I don't think Trevor is going to be down the dole office. Put it that way. I'm sure he'll find other things to do.
At very least, he's got Jurassic World in his resume. Like it or hate it, huge success, competent film in my opinion. And but then I say that as someone who wasn't a big Jurassic Park guy in the first place. So it's not slaying a sacred cow for me. It really isn't.
Yeah, no. In fact, I never really understood the appeal to a large extent of that universe. And I have a
one day, but I will say I think it's less a Spielberg, certainly from his golden era.
Yeah.
But I'll expand on that all the time. It's a very important film to a lot of people, and that's fine. I don't want to like.
But Trevorrow still has the keys to that kingdom, doesn't he? Because although he's not directing the new one, he was involved in its development. He's the executive producer.
He's got a track record. Josh Trank has Chronicle, which is a $30 million film that isn't shot like a traditional film anyway.
Yeah.
And Fantastic Four, which was horrendous. So if anything, I think Josh Trank's the one that's come out of this damaged.
Yeah.
Lord and Miller haven't, because they can still make whatever they want.
Yeah.
It's just perhaps you weren't like for the Star Wars universe, in the same way that Edgar Wright has got too much authorship of what he does to fit into the Marvel universe.
Yeah, but you know, the important thing is, I'm sure there'll be a statement, and it'll all have a happily ever after ending. And this is sort of an Empire Strikes Back style cliffhanger. But whoever directs, you know, the final thing will have their little Return of the Jedi moment, literally for the Return of the Jedi close of that second trilogy. But
Just be fine. If you're making a film every year, the quality will vary anyway.
Yeah.
And even if the quality was absolutely uniform, there's, you know, everyone's got a different view anyway. I've seen so many people slag off the new Star Wars films. I think they brought it back in excellent style. So,
yeah. I mean, I enjoy it. But it's funny you mention that about content, about more content, because moving on a little bit, one of the other stories this week was this, and it is a story because I think it's been reported by a lot of official outlets. Amazon and Apple have joined the race to maybe buy the Bond rights. And I think one of the themes there that immediately comes to mind is, I see where they're going with this. We're talking shared universe. We're talking day in the office for Moneypenny and, Blofeld the early years and, all sorts of that stuff. The very kind of brand control I think the Broccolis have fought to kind of, protect the Bond brand from that kind of exploitation is potentially on the table if a distributor of that nature were to get hold of it. But I don't know how far that is along on the table. But
from what we're hearing, and it's word of mouth, and it's rumour, and you've got to be very careful with this. But you do get a feel over time for what rumour sounds right and what doesn't. Warners have been the favourite. Warners have been the favourite for about the last 3 years. So that's not new. I still expect it to be Warner Brothers, but I don't fear it in the same way as some of the fans. I mean, in my opinion, and it's only my opinion, Bond fans are a conservative lot anyway. They really, really struggle with like change and difference.
But then the character is built on that. Is built on conservatism with a small c.
It's traditional and Britain and all that bullshit. Now, as far as I'm concerned, if I were a Bond fan listening to me saying this, I'd be like, who the fuck do you think you are to speak for me?
Yeah, who the fuck do you think you are to speak for me, Dave?
But when I go on Bond forums, you can see it. You can just see that general. There's a huge fear of this. Now, at its very worst, of course, at its very worst, you can have a Bond film every year, and actors burning themselves out every 2 years, and a revolving door of directors, and the young Bond adapted for Netflix or Amazon Prime, depending on obviously if they want the one that got it. And books and video games and everything else. But there's a sliding scale between that and what we have now. And what we have now is we have a couple of really wonderful custodians of the series. I'm not going to knock them at all, but Michael G. Wilson is heading towards 80. I don't know his exact age, but he's definitely
75.
Right, okay, so he is on his way to 80. Certainly after the next film comes out, he's only going to be a year or two away from that. Barbara Broccoli is coming up towards 60. I think she was born in 1960, actually. And they've both done a great job, but you look at it at the moment, the films are getting ever further apart. We're basing most things on the opinion of two people, in that they have the final word on hirings and firings. Not every Bond film is a slam dunk. They've made their share of errors too. But also, we've got a completely underexploited universe here, and that term, exploited, worries fans. I know, because they think it's just going to be mined into an early grave after 57 years, but not 55 years.
Sure.
But if I look at it at the moment, in the last 10 years, we've had a 50th anniversary, and it was actually, in the scheme of things, pretty useless. I mean, the main thing is the films are properly restored, and they're restored to 4K, so they'll come out in UHD soon. And that's the main thing. They've all got commentaries on them, it's a good presentation. But the extras are crap. The new discs that come out are not particularly luxurious home releases in any way. They've got no forward path in terms of where the series goes, and hiring and firing, it's very hand to mouth. And then you look at some of the wider elements we probably would like. Well, video games. The last Bond video game was in 2012, and it was horrendous. Everything from the game itself to the artwork for 007 Legends was terrible. Bloodstone came out in something like 2010, and that was okay. But you think, well, if you had a more corporate mindset ahead of this, the films would be more regular, every couple of years or every third year, and that would be an end to it. That's what's happening. They would, we know at the end of a Bond film when the next one's coming, even if it was 3 years down the line. We'd have tie-in games. We'd have things like Star Wars has Celebration. And you've got other studios going to things like D23 and Comic-Con.
Yeah.
Bond never does anything like that. The closest we have is Bond Stars in Pinewood, but that's a relatively small event based on lottery anyway.
Yeah.
I put my name into the hat this year and didn't get it, but that's fine because it's the first time I've ever put my name in. I wouldn't necessarily expect to get it. That's not a problem. But where's the Bond presence at like Comic-Con? Where's the Bond version of Celebration? Where's the Bond video games? Where are the Bond spin-offs? I mean, someone says, "Oh, as I inevitably start repeating myself. But it's a little bit like Formula One, and I'm sure I've made this commonality before. Formula One has an aging fan base. Okay, I'm a pretty typical fan at my age. I've been following it since the 80s, and I love it, and I've always loved it. But they're doing nothing to bring younger people in. The social media aspect of it is rubbish. You know, one video game a year and that's it. And until recently, you had a guy at the head of the sport who thought you should only market to like 70-year-olds because they've got money. So, you know, you can market Rolexes because they can buy it. What's the point? You know, marketing to young people. Well, you market to young people because one day their careers might take off. And you've got some... And I think... I don't know that it's exactly the same with Bond films. Every generation finds Bond. But, you know, there's a lot out there competing for the bandwidth. And to just leave it in the hands of Eon forevermore is fine, but then it becomes like a family dynasty. The two that are doing it now can't do it forever. I think Michael G. Wilson's got a couple of sons, David and Greg. Well, one of them was involved with was he involved with 007 or was he involved with the GoldenEye video game remake? One of the two. But, you know, they're not really stepping up to grab the reins. And frankly, just because you've got a kid and you're in a certain industry doesn't mean they'd be any good at it anyway.
Yeah.
There's a part of me that just thinks, well, yes, of course I don't want a Bond film every 6 months and a Moneypenny film and a Felix Leiter film and and MI6 on TV and the Bond thing on TV and then racing games and first-person games. And of course it can be overexploited when it's a series that's based around one man. But we're at the other extreme at the moment. They are not doing enough of it, in my opinion.
Yeah, they have to play the game or get out of the game, basically. That's the thing. Is that rather risk oversaturation than risk being wiped out by those brands that are saturating better, I suppose, is one way of looking at it.
But it doesn't mean that it's going to be like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. No one is saying that, you know, after 10 years we'll have another 20, you know, we'll have as many Bond films in the next 10 years as we've had in the last 55.
Yeah.
No one is saying, but at the moment, a Bond film finishes, it goes silent. And you've got Daniel Craig saying things like, I think everyone's just tired. Well, that's what happens when you've got two people running it who aren't getting any younger. You know? So I know it's sacrilege to say it, and I have to, for everything I'm saying, this is the brave take a punt bit of my personality, because I'm actually quite frightened myself that it will get sold off and fucked up.
Yeah.
But I tend to think it can't carry on like it is. As successful as the last two films have been, you can't keep knocking out a film every 3 to 4 years with constant hand to mouth about where it's going next, about distribution, about direction, about everything, and never turning up to things like Comic-Con or a version of Star Wars Celebration. You've got Star Trek conventions. Now, not all of that will be appropriate for Bond, but they don't do any of it.
Yep.
Nothing.
Yeah, they could at least try, I think. You know, see if it works. And if it doesn't work, well, so what?
It needs fresh ideas. And that doesn't mean fundamentally changing the series and sticking fucking Bond in trainers. You know.
No.
You know, it doesn't mean fundamentally changing the films. It really, really doesn't. It just means having a little bit more certainty of when content is coming out.
Yeah.
A little bit more of a team to put effort into it, because Eon are a small company. Put, you know, a bit more effort into like some of the cross-platform things. There should be Bond video games. There should be more of them. Whereas at the moment we're getting 3 films a decade if we're lucky, and a book every couple of years.
Yeah, and I mean, not you know, if it's about even just being a little bit more daring of what you can do with it, doesn't even have to be forward-thinking technological. I mean, I remember quite a precocious move on my part when I was, but I was quite precocious and ambitious. I think I was about 19, 20. They were making The World Is Not Enough at the time. And I approached Eon about putting Bond on stage. I thought, you know, this hasn't been done. It's an interesting idea. I had read the Quantum of Solace short story as a play, yeah, just as a play, as a straight kind of a two-hander type thing. Almost like, I think what I had in mind was what they did with The Woman in Black, which is a very simple but very effective stage play that does have special effects and so on, but it's they're sparingly used. It's basically a two-hander that has a sort of a punctuation and a narrative. and I had happened to I had picked up the Quantum of Solace short story after a particularly late night of study or something, and it just occurred to me that it's very theatrical. You could do this as a two-hander. And it was at the time where I suppose the brand was, bearing in mind that during the Brosnan era, one could argue that even though the Craig ones have made more money, we talk about brand awareness and saturation, it was a bit more energetic then. We talk about energy. There was something about, maybe it was my perception or something as a younger man, but there was something about the appetite for Bond back then that was felt more satisfied. Of course, we were pre-social media, we were pre-certain technological advances, but they were at once, as usual, very protective of the brand, but also very approachable because they are a small company. And I got as far as letters and phone calls. Now, to some extent, that could have been down as a product of where I was doing it from. Obviously, I was doing it from an Oxford college. Maybe that lent it a certain cachet because they'd filmed there and so on. Perhaps I presented it particularly well as a genuinely interesting idea. But I do think that, yeah, there are certain ways of tapping into this brand with the Broccoli still keeping at least financial and nominal creative control without completely selling it off in a way that does at least potentially leave it open to going down the wrong avenues, and in a way that Albert R. Broccoli wouldn't have liked, bearing in mind that his whole mantra was, look, everybody thinks they know how to do this, everybody has an idea on how to do this, everybody wants to buy it so that they can exploit it further, but that's not the way to do it. Now, one could argue that times have changed, and they have, but on the other hand, I think his essential idea was just keep that integrity somehow. So maybe some additional licensing, some additional assignment of certain elements of the copyright. Bearing in mind, of course, that ultimately it all becomes academic, because when you hit 70 years after the death of Fleming, it's public domain anyway, so everyone can go and make James Bond product, but not with that particular Sheen. And I think the other thing that people maybe forget occasionally is that when we think of James Bond, ostensibly we're talking about the appeal of the character and his world. That's true. But really, when we think even of certain visuals, it's interesting. There was that picture, did you see me comment on the other day, the one of Daniel Craig doing the screen test? Little things like just the visuals of the screen tests, or the kind of rooms, the production design, everything. That is a specific product, not of this specific world of James Bond, but even more specifically of that unit that has produced the films, and their aesthetic. And as Never Say Never Again proved to some extent, you can maybe capture some of that, but you can never quite get the essence of it. And that's why, even if it had been canon, even if Fleming himself had written the stories, which he didn't, because, I think we covered this before, we don't want to see a young kid James Bond, because the whole point of Bond to some extent is that, yes, he is a kid in a 30-something body, and that's entertaining to watch as a 30-something looking back, or a 10 to 20-something looking forwards. And those little qualities are ultimately, I think, a kind of it's so difficult to articulate. But I do know this. I know it's specifically a product of the visual scheme of that series, which doesn't age, which doesn't date. And therefore, the model, And
it very slowly evolves because, Casino Royale, I picked Casino Royale deliberately because it's an adaptation of a Fleming book.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like Goldfinger.
No.
Times do move on, but they move on so subtly, so tastefully.
And the weird thing, Dave, about Casino Royale is that, yes, it was moving forwards at the time. I mean, Casino Royale as a move hurt. I've always said that progress requires hurt. That shock, because it was. I mean, I even hated it at the time when I first saw it, the first few times. I've grown to love it partly because objectively you realise it's a bloody great piece of filmmaking, and second because with maturity you can start to relate more to Bond's emotional journey. But at the time, I suppose I wasn't ready for it. But the thing is, if you look at it, it was a move forwards insofar as it was, yes, responding to a darker, more less frivolous world. But it was also, and yet to some extent, the Bourne factor and so on. But it was also, in many senses, a step back in terms of style and tone. It's a timeless film. Yes, it's 2006, but it has a sense of almost period Sheen about it.
That once you throw in laptops and phones, of course it's going to date.
Yeah.
But it's going to date so nicely with that film. It just is.
And it doesn't make the laptops and phones center stage in a way that I think to some extent Skyfall and Spectre make the mistake very slightly of doing, because I do think those films will date, much as I like them.
The Quantum is the one that really pushed it.
Because of the editing.
Yeah, but also if you think of MI6 in that film, they went away from like a traditional look for it and put sort of Judi Dench in kind of very Minority Report type working environment.
Yes, it could have been Tony Stark's lab or something.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think all the Craig films are aging okay. I mean, obviously Spectre's only 2 years old, but certainly the first 2 entries are dated all right. But I think what I'm saying is, like, it's fine to be cautious. I get that, because I'm a bit nervy for all the grandstanding I've just done.
Yeah.
But I tend to think it's gonna, unless there are a couple of filmmakers behind those two that are ready to take the reins and do really well and have a vision, then this is going to have to happen at some point. Yeah. And I think we are now stretching the gap between Bond films every time. They have no idea of things like video games. They have no idea about, you know, the Comic-Cons of this world and stuff. And I'm starting to think, right, you're missing an opportunity now. You're missing an opportunity now. Now, I'd rather have what we have now than somebody comes in and completely fucks it up.
Yeah.
But Amazon and Apple and companies like that aren't stupid.
No, I know, yeah.
They are. You know, they can learn a market. I mean, yes, they're less experienced with films and so on, but
they're getting there. They're catching up.
And in some respects, I mean, Disney bought Lucasfilm, but it's still Lucasfilm.
Yeah.
You know, they bought Marvel, but it's still Marvel. It's not just going to be run directly from a board meeting. You know?
Yeah. But in the meantime, anyway, at the very least, we do get Bond 25 in 2019. They're already... I said clickbait had stopped, but this didn't seem to be clickbait. This was Hollywood Reporter, I think it was, or the New York Times or something, had leaked the treatment or something, that it is basically taken with James Bond. And he is married in Bond 25, and she is, I don't know, kidnapped or murdered or put in some sort of tricky situation. Bond to the rescue. And, I mean, two schools of thought on that. Number one is... isn't that incredibly lazy and predictable? And how can Bond be married? School of thought number two is, well,
he's been married before.
He's been married before, and you can kind of say, well, look, if it's done in such a way that it's an original spin on the trite material, then that is exactly what the best Bond movies are. And with that kind of simplicity, Skyfall has an incredibly simple, incredibly derivative premise, but it is executed incredibly well. When they try and be a little bit more sophisticated frequently, it doesn't quite work. And the ones which, as I say, I mean, at their simplest, they are at their best. So if you think about it, in reality, if he's a real person, not that he is, but in real time he's going to be 50 by the time that film is made. Maybe he took a little bit longer to get married, but yeah, marriage would be on the table. 2, if it's literally the Tracy Bond scenario, it's not a literal remake of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. If literally it's just in the story that he is married, and they don't make a big deal of it being an inverted commas love story, and something happens to her. And I think the third condition really for me is that provided that there is some sort of bigger picture to it that is typically Bondian. I mean, we've talked about License to Kill before. Even the fans forget. License to Kill does have a little bit of a Bondian payoff insofar as, yes, it's a personal vendetta film, and yes, it's incredibly dark and brutal and as real as Bond can get while still being Bond. But towards the end, you have a sort of a twist, and I kind of wish they'd given it an English spin, like he'd been restored to office just before the end because Sanchez was going to do something in Britain or something. But there is a subplot where Sanchez is plotting to down an airplane or something, which means that the bigger picture goes beyond the simple, oh, this is a revenge story. I also did a quick Facebook update, just playfully, sort of recurring pitch that I keep pushing, which is, what if they don't do the whole wife has died thing? What if they just have it as a simple fact of the matter that he has got married, and in sort of that True Lies fashion, where Arnold is able...
I'm not laughing at you, I'm laughing at the fact that because we're friends on Facebook, I've seen that so many
Yeah, no, I keep pushing it, but... But I mean, it is possible. True Lies...
James, that's fascinating, but this is a great British Bake Off thread.
Yes, no, I do keep pushing it. But I mean, in True Lies, which we talked about last time, Arnold is basically a thinly disguised sort of take on Bond, and he's married. But he still flirts with the glamorous girls. You can still have the trappings of it. So my theory was, well, why not do something a bit like that? Yeah, Bond got married. Don't make a thing of it. Don't devote half the movie to him thinking about it, or, you know, going off on one, or it becoming, in inverted commas, a romance, which can go so wrong if it's not written, directed, and executed perfectly. Equally, please don't, unless they absolutely have to, do the whole either rush the death of a wife in the pre-title sequence and have him do a bit of a Dark Knight Rises, grows depression beard, sits in a corner for 5 minutes and then gets revenge and gets reactivated by it, because we've done that twice if you count Skyfall, in the sense of him being resurrected, and certainly in Quantum of Solace, the revenge mission. But what you could do is have her potentially as the final reveal. So almost like a Mrs. Columbo meets Prizzi's Honor via Mr. and Mrs. Smith. You keep the fun, you keep a hint of pathos and darkness, you have a bigger picture mission that's pretty self-contained, that isn't about him finding himself for the umpteenth time, but just in that last shot, Mrs. Bond, who may well be Léa Seydoux. I know a lot of people didn't feel that relationship worked, or the chemistry was wrong, but she is a good actress, and she can do Psycho, she can do Evil, just a split-second hint. They've even, I mean, if you take something like Live and Let Die, that bit where Bond is at breakfast with Rosie, and there's the dropped card, the tarot card, do you remember that? I mean, that's a very superficial example, but in Bond history, there are moments like that, where Bond has been incredibly naive about a woman for all of his experience, and he just gets betrayed, and he gets not heartbroken necessarily, you don't have to make it a huge thing of it, but just, I think they could go there and yet not go there. I think it's possible to have a third way approach, where we get the Bond movie we need, which is a self-contained mission, fun, blast it, send Daniel out on a high, and show him doing Bond stuff. Scuba, ski, beating the crap out of people, gambling, shagging, whatever, but you still have just this emotional payoff, which is kind of a sine qua non of the Craig era. It has to be there, it's what people expect. That's how I do it anyway. She turns out to be a baddie. He marries Mrs. Bond. You don't make a huge deal of it until the very end, and there's just a look she gives, or there's a hint or something. But, you know, some people gave it a like. It's not going to happen, of course, but it's not terribly original either, I suppose, but you know what I mean. You've gone to sleep already.
I mean, I don't envy them having to do this. They put themselves into this in the first place, but I don't think bringing Bond back is that straightforward without effectively covering old ground, because we've already been there in Quantum of Solace as well, which doesn't help. It's only 3 films ago that he was like blinded by inconsolable rage. So yeah.
Which I didn't actually buy, to be honest, in that film. I mean, because the thing about Quantum of Solace, people call it the revenge one or something. I didn't get that vibe from him. I thought he was literally just doing his job in that film. There's a conspiracy to illegally rearrange the dominoes in South America. As part of that, there is a spin-off to them getting control of the water, which is a very real world concern, real problem, as in people believe that wars of the future could be fought over, you know, water consumption, water use. Yeah. And yeah, there are references to Vesper, and yes, there's that moment of closure at the end, which is very Dalton-esque, you know, where you sort of sit down. You know, that bit where he goes, I remember when I was teaching, to make teaching occasionally just a bit more glamorous in my own mind, if I had to say to a kid, sit down, I think a little bit of Craig was a kind of sit down. And it's just great fun. It's a little bit like the way Dalton suddenly goes very clipped, you know, get out, get in, that sort of thing. But it wasn't a huge emotional, the huge emotional arc people think it is. It's a self-contained, very short, incidentally, very kind of pulpy little thriller, Quantum of Solace, for all of its flaws, of which there are many. But yeah, I think the myth is that a film either has to be the purely self-contained adventure thriller that doesn't have an emotional arc, or that it has to spend, and I think this is yet again, we've talked about this before, the kind of the legacy of the Nolan influence, which is fine because that's the zeitgeist, but this idea that a huge chunk of a film for a hero's arc has to be explicitly not only showing but also telling how he's feeling, what he's coming to terms with. There are ways of using great dialogue and script and emotional vigor. I mean, we were talking about Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade manages to do that just so brilliantly. The conversations between Sean Connery and Harrison Ford that tell a backstory, but still show to some extent, without having to get too immersed in it or lose the sense of This is a mission, there is a ticking clock, there is an objective, and the fun is still there. You know?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is now, hardcore Bond fans are very much a subset of the whole number of you who are going to see them. But you can feel it in the water now. If you go to forums, that there's a desire. I mean, I wouldn't want this. And I think art by its nature can't be open to like democracy. I don't think it's let's make what the fans want. But certainly you have to be a little bit aware of it now. That fans are now talking about why can't we just have a standalone mission? And they're saying it with a hint of anger, that they're sick of all this personal stakes bullshit and going rogue.
Yeah.
And that's the tone of what I'm reading. Now, that doesn't mean they have to capitulate to that entirely. But there's something in the water.
Yeah, I think
people are tiring of constantly, he's gone rogue and this time it's personal.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting is that all of these franchises are doing the whole gone rogue thing. Ethan Hunt in Mission Impossible has gone rogue in pretty much, I think. Yeah, everything. Now, the real reason, if one looks at this, is quite simple, because in the absence of a Cold War, of course we have villains, we have ISIL, we have North Korea, we have, as kind of Spectrum and Quantum show, we have unfettered corporate evil. And the Batman series, the Nolan Batmans take a very similar approach, which is to have sort of a slicing of the three evils. You start with local thuggery, a mob, or whatever. You graduate to corporate, and then you have the ultimate expression that is some sort of terror threat. Well, for Bond or any kind of spy thriller, he's got to be one man against an army. He's got to have an obstacle to face, and he's got to be against that. So if he's not rogue, and it's simply without obstacles, or if there isn't that personal stake or a need to complicate the mission, you're going to actually run out of ways to make it convincing if it's not the old school period piece. Because particularly in the era of technology, and particularly, I suppose, in a post-nuclear era, I mean, people can bring up North Korea or whatever it is, but the likelihood of an agent like Bond being dropped into a foreign nation on a self-contained mission and having to work his way against a secret police, and doing so successfully, particularly if he is James Bond and he's not an infiltration disguise sort of a person who can, look foreign or whatever, it's almost an impossible thing to simply logistically navigate. Now, one could argue that if you propel the fantasy enough, you can convince people of that. And I think that's to its credit. I think that is one thing that the Brosnan era does particularly well. But I do think it gets increasingly difficult to do that. I think the other thing that people forget is, who's to say Bond isn't having self-contained save-the-world missions all the time? What makes the story interesting is the fact that...
Hang on a minute. Yeah? That is not going to... that's not going to appease fans who want to see one.
Yeah.
You say,
okay.
Between the films.
Well, yeah, no, sure. But, I mean, the thing is, as a film, to please people more beyond that fan base... yeah, I mean, it's a tough call. I think there's no question, I've said this before elsewhere, the Craig era is a galactically missed opportunity. They could have made more films. Some of them could have been personal. Some of them could have been a bit more self-contained. Theoretically, if they had done one every year since his tenure began, they could have done faithful adaptations of every Fleming novel, and he'd now be finished his tenure, but that simply wasn't an option on the table. You can't please everybody. I do think that maybe with the rise of things like Kingsman and so on, people are starting to say, well, why can't we just have a fun, rollicking romp? But what's interesting about Kingsman that people forget...
People don't know what they want. All I'm saying is, if you look around forums now, the general direction of the series is now starting to tire Bond fans of the constant, personal stakes and all that shit. But at the same time, you've only got to look at, people's ideas when it comes to things like casting. People don't know what they want. If you opened it up to sort of democracy, the end result would be a mess. Yeah.
Well, I know what I don't want, but I'm not gonna say, because everyone knows what I don't want. But there you go. But I think the thing is, and one of the reasons people are critical of Brosnan's era, is that they're people-pleasing films that try to please everybody, and they try to have that sort of self-contained, what would be now maybe today a sort of a Kingsman-style fantasy, self-contained, save the world mission. But then, as a postscript to people who enjoyed the more Daltonite and now Craig approach, they will throw in a moment of loss, or, you know, as you point out, borderline necrophilia, where he has literally 2 seconds to mourn a severe loss, and in order to do that in 2 seconds, they have him kiss a dead body, which is in no way creepy or something. It's just a product of the fact that, right, Pierce,
no,
got,
it isn't. It's just a running joke.
yeah, but a lot of people make it. No, but a lot of people make it because I can say you're rushing these more profound subtexts without the license to do so.
When he had Paris and Dr. Cuthbert dead in the same hotel room.
Yeah, no, that was just disgusting. There are deleted scenes, in fact, to that effect. But that leads us into the bigger picture here, which is, you know, speaking of third way, and can you please everybody? Let's talk about the man before we talk about the movies. Blair, do you want to go there? What do you think of him? What's your memory of him? What's your position on him?
I'm quite happy to go there. I don't know that I will live to see a degree of optimism that I saw on May the 2nd, 1997 ever again. And I'm grateful for that, if it else. In terms of my politics, like most people, I'm slightly to the left of Blair. But I'm only slightly to the left of Blair. I think what Blair had that was very sensible was that he understood profoundly that elections are one in the middle. And it does frustrate me with Corbyn, because Corbyn won't win an election as long as he's got a hole in his arse. Now he did better at the last one than we ever expected, and he had an exceptionally good campaign, but we can't win an election that far left, unfortunately. And you can say to me as often as you like, well, how left is he really? It doesn't fucking matter, it's public perception. Blair was an extremely gifted politician. He did lack a little bit of gravitas early on. He was very baby-faced when he first took the role. And he always had quite a high voice, actually, Blair. So, and he insisted on calling New Labour all the time. So there was a lot about him I found very lightweight. But whatever your politics, it is pretty much difficult to argue with the fact that some of our essential public services were in trouble in the mid-90s. People were dying on sort of hospital trolleys waiting for beds. It needed more money. It was as simple as that. And so there was a moment in time when the nation needed a change of government. Just psychologically, it needed a change of government. And the country felt young and renewed that day in a way it's never felt since. And in some respects, a lot of that was stage managed. I mean, you see all the footage of him walking down Downing Street and shaking hands and the euphoria. That was all stage managed by the Labour Party. But I'll always remember that more than I remember anything else about it. The other thing I will say is he was still, and I haven't got the figures in front of me to back this up, but he was still very, very popular up until Iraq. I mean, the Tories didn't even take a lead in the poll even fleetingly until the fuel crisis, which was 3.5 years in. About 4 years in, they had foot and mouth. Those things both damaged the government a bit. But really, until 2003, this was an extraordinarily popular government, and it all fell apart to the point that he will never be safe the rest of his life now. Blair will have to have, guarded. He will have to be guarded everywhere he goes for the rest of his life now.
Yeah. So, but for Iraq, he might still not be in power, but he...
All politicians outlive their time. You know, and in some respects, Blair always says that he started as one type of Prime Minister and became another. And I can almost hear people who don't like him almost talking back to my comments here, that it's not about whether you like him, it's not about, yes, he became a shit one, none of that. I'm just talking about style and conviction. He became much more of a conviction politician as he went on, I felt. But to his detriment, in some respects.
Well, all political careers end in failure, don't they? I mean, it's a cliche, but it's true. He had to fail.
Yes, but I mean, it wasn't just that. When I look back on that government, you have that, but they also very, very, their attitude to civil liberties was positively right-wing. In that the idea that governments use threats to reduce our freedoms is not new. But the whole 42 days, and then he wanted 90 days at one point, detention without charge for suspects. And it just came to a point where he was just asking for a degree of power that wasn't balanced by any reasonable understanding of threat. He wanted us all to pay a fortune for ID cards, which is just like, what's the fucking point? And Iraq, he got badly wrong. Where I differ from some people is, I still think he was very, very wrong. But maybe it's because I don't have family in the armed forces, or maybe I don't know anyone who was directly affected by this. But I do think he genuinely thought what he did. I think he thought he was doing what he thought was right. I don't hate the guy for it, but there's no doubt in my mind it was a horrific mistake. Had he not gone to Iraq, I think he would have won a third landslide, because he lost a good percentage of his vote in 2005. He still won by 6 seats, I think it was. But they only got like 39-40% of the vote. Well, a couple more percent of the vote and you'd be looking at landslide territory again. So had they got a third landslide in 2005, there is a very good chance they would have held on to some kind of win in 2010. So Iraq has completely changed the face of British politics.
Yeah. So in effect, he becomes the author of the very thing that he's fighting against now. Now, there's some people out there who think that he's talking Brexit to get some sense of relevance so that he can be on the stage again. I think maybe that is the case. I'm not unsympathetic to that. I mean, I think one of the... I mentioned earlier on, even at a personal level, how you can look back on a particular point of your career and you want to recapture that. And I don't think he's alone in that. I think it's a very human thing to want to do. Whether it's constructive, I'm not so sure. I mean, I was watching Andrew Marr this morning, and he's... I
didn't see it. I heard he was on it this morning, was he?
Yeah, it's Blair in a nutshell. It really is, because there's this point where he's adamant that, look, we can put another deal on the table and give people an option. I think Andrew Marr sort of intervenes and says, yeah, but Tony, we can't really, can we? Because Article 50 has been triggered. And Blair just looks at him and shrugs his shoulders, goes, yeah, so so what? Which is, it's just Blair in a nutshell, which is that he understands the bigger picture. People who think he's intellectually lightweight or lacking in forensic attention to detail, I think have got it wrong. But his cavalier, casual, almost teenager-like attitude to monumentally important structures that have defined British democracy and continue to do so. He just doesn't get that, and even now out of office, seems to believe that he can swan in with a kind of
in office, it's worth. I mean, there's a couple of books written by Andrew Rawnsley about the Labour governments plural. By governments plural, I mean 97 to 2010, obviously, because you've got 3 separate parliaments, 2 separate prime ministers. But the first one is called Servants of the People.
Yeah.
And that takes you up to roughly the end of the first term. And then the much longer one is called The End of the Party, which takes you right the way through the rest of the Labour government. You hear all about Gordon Brown's tantrums and everything else. He had a lot of access. He's broadly sympathetic. I mean, I would think Andrew Rawnsley, he writes for The Observer for a start, but I would think Andrew Rawnsley is probably fairly soft-left himself. But it's as honest as anything can be when it's written by somebody who, because anyone who works in politics or political journalism will be to some degree partisan. You grew up with an interest in politics that comes with the territory, but the books are very interesting, and it's interesting because of Blair's attitude to cabinet government around things like the Dome, around things like how the civil service were trying to tell him what the procedures were, and he just didn't get it. It was like, well, just email the cabinet. Cabinet meetings were just there to rubber stamp It was always called the sort of sofa style of government, and it was very true. I mean, he didn't have the patience for debate, and he wasn't much of a parliamentarian either.
No.
He was a pretty good speaker in Parliament, but he wasn't a Parliament guy particularly. It was all about the force of his personality, and it would have been entirely his personality, but for the fact that the first film we covered today covers the very fact that he had to cede a lot of power to Gordon Brown before they even got there.
Yeah. So let's get into that then. So it's a trilogy, and I'm not sure quite how planned out in advance the stages were. I'm of the view that I think Peter Morgan obviously wanted to tell the whole story. It's interesting that they haven't as yet gone to Iraq. They haven't done a full.
The clue I would say is that the casting is fairly similar from the Queen to the Special relationship, i.e. the same person playing Cherie and stuff. Whereas Cherie is played by somebody different in the deal, and it's a little bit earlier. I tend to think the Queen probably prompted them to make it a trilogy.
Right, yes.
I suspect. It's only a guess, though, based on look, feel, casting, and all that sort of thing. I think the deal probably sprung all of its own.
Right. Because the deal is a Channel 4 thing. It's almost a docudrama, almost. I mean, it is a film, but it's very minimal.
They start by saying that they say they've invented dialogue, but they've gone off parliamentary records and sources and so on. So they're presenting it as truthful in its strokes. I was about to say it's broad strokes, but actually they're saying the details are pretty accurate.
Yeah.
But they know what went on at a certain meeting, but they've got to fabricate the dialogue to represent that.
Yeah, and I don't think they take any monumental liberties with it. I think it feels real, and it feels like real dialogue. Because we were talking before, in previous podcasts about what dialogue feels real. Well, this is a political film, and yet you don't get that kind of Star Wars prequel Nolan Batman business of let's have an entire lecture speech about the meaning of democracy or something. There's a real sense of emotion and character sketch.
It's real people doing a job. I mean, nearly everything that's presented to us as the public is... To say it's a lie is unfair, really, because if Gordon Brown and Tony Blair have a debate at length who's going to run or whether they both run and it ends in rows, they're not going to put out a public statement that says we fought like cat and dog over this.
No.
They have to dress it up, and 99% of what comes out to us is dressed up in one way or another.
Exactly like the thing we were talking about with Star Wars, with Trevorrow. We don't know, but we know it probably wasn't as amicable as however they're going to paint it. But they're not.
But it's just not our business either.
Yeah.
And I know we vote for these people, but I mean, the deal feels pretty real to me. It feels like ordinary people doing a job. They're just normal people. They are normal people. People forget that with politicians. Particularly John Smith. John Smith is played by Frank Kelly, and he was best known as Father Jack Hackett.
Yeah.
In Father Ted. I would say unrecognisable. I could recognise it was him, but obviously in his very, very different role.
Yeah.
And that sort of captured everything I think I know about John Smith, and it captures everything I think I know about Brown and Blair. That Blair was the more everyday people of the two of them. Yes, he was public school educated, but when he gets together with another guy, he wants to sit and just talk guy stuff. And Gordon Brown was very buttoned up, very into the job, and Gordon Brown in this program would be dating someone, and Tony Blair wasn't quite sure if he was still dating her and things like that. And yet Tony Blair was his closest friend in Parliament for years.
Yeah.
And that does kind of reflect what we know of the men in question. They very wisely they intercut it very nicely with footage from the time, and then they don't cast people you see in archive footage as well. So there's a bit where, I forget who it is now, let's for the argument's sake say Peter Sissons, I don't think it was, but Peter Sissons or somebody is interviewing two talking heads from two different places, and one's Gordon Brown and one's Ken Clark. Well, Ken Clark is Ken Clark, and Gordon Brown is obviously David Morrissey who's playing him. Yeah. You see that all the way through.
Yes.
You only once or twice, I think, do you see footage. You don't get a recast of Neil Kinnock because you've seen footage of Neil Kinnock, and then because we've got a fictionalised John Smith, we don't see footage of him talking.
No.
So I actually, it is clearly the cheapest production of the 4 films we're talking about today.
Yeah.
It's the shortest. But it was the one that most interested me, and I think that is probably a reflection of a couple of things. One of those 2 things we'll talk about when we get to the Queen. The other is I'm fundamentally more interested in domestic politics, just generally. And one of the problems I had with Blair as his reign went on is that it all became about foreign affairs, and you felt that if you tried to get him talking about the health service or education, he sort of moved beyond that. He wasn't as interested as he once was.
Well, historically, of course, that's what politicians do, because they.
Certainly presidents do, but presidents' second terms are always very foreign affairs heavy.
It's the ultimate distraction, and I think Blair was probably more frightened of facing off against the unions in the UK than he was against facing Al Qaeda in the Middle East.
The big tragedy of the Blair government is, for me, that they never quite realised how powerful they were. People could talk about the politicians and their arrogance all they like, but one of the repeating themes of certainly the first term Tory Labour government is they governed like their right to govern was still on a knife edge. And yet they had like an historic majority. But more than that, although the depth of their support was like wide but shallow, the Tories were a mess until Cameron came along, really.
Yeah,
so,
but then he's just, history will judge him as a poor man's Blair, cosplayer, basically.
Yes, he will. But it took them 8 years to realise if you can't beat them, copy them.
Yeah.
It took the Tories 8 years to do that. They're doing it now with the Labour are now doing this. Governments, when governments are beaten, they tend to retreat into their shell and head towards what they perceive to be their natural support, and it takes them years to get drawn back to the centre. Look at the Tories. They got beat. The Major got beaten, and on election night, you could hear it happening. They were like, "Oh, we didn't get our message across enough." No, people were just tired of you. Yeah. Whether it's right, wrong, or somewhere in between, they were tired of you.
But that's something that the deal portrays, is the frustration that because we do get Blair the everyman. He's a very nice guy, clearly, and he wants to do, as you pointed out, he wants to be just mates with Brown and have a little downtime between the work. They work exceptionally well as a team, it seems, with the sort of forensic attention to the legalities of policy, and they're having great fun with that. It's like, in a lot of television shows, we get this kind of arc where that something has to come to a head when a double act is having too much fun together. Something's going to have to tear that double act apart. So even though it's a film that is literally beat for beat reflecting what happened, the tragedy, literally the tragedy of a friendship that's torn apart literally by a shared devotion to a shared aim, but with a different emphasis and method. And one gets the feeling that and Brown is almost.
When you look at Blair, I mean, they got some details, some quite minor details, very very right. Blair's first blast into public consciousness, if you like, is he was Home Affairs spokesman under John Smith.
Yeah.
I think he might have been under Kinnock as well, actually, but maybe he was environment under Kinnock. He was a front bencher under Kinnock, but after '92, he was Home Affairs spokesman, and he came up with that saying, "Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime." And that saying is what sort of launched him into public consciousness. It's one of the first things people remember about Tony Blair. And the film doesn't make a big deal of it. But Brown just in an aside says, "Yeah, it was good when I wrote it." And he did. Brown, he was on the phone with Blair, and Blair says this, I think, in his book. He says that he was on the phone to Brown, and he's trying to explain what it is he's trying to say. And Brown says, "Well, you're basically saying tough on crime, but tough on the causes of crime." And he was like, "Yes, that's brilliant." So they work so well together. I find it very sad where it went. I really do.
But it goes where it goes because Blair has a more. Sorry, you were saying. Sorry. I'll finish my bit and then you can. Yeah. The idea is what cuts it off, if you like, and this is something that the film does very well, Blair reaches an elastic limit when they lose in '92, and you can almost see it. It's almost like Michael Corleone in The Godfather, or one of those. And this is how good the filmmaking is, where below the budget, and this is how good the acting is and the editing and everything. It's literally a look. You see him slumped in a chair, hearing it, and I think he gets on the phone.
Another 4 years.
Yeah, and it's at that point.
Another 4 years. And do you know the tragedy of him saying that?
Yeah.
It wasn't 4 years. It was 5 years.
Yeah.
That was optimistic, because governments back then, we didn't have the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Governments basically parliaments would be for 5 years.
Yeah.
But typically, you could call an election whenever you wanted. And what governments would do is, if it looked good, they'd go after 4. So Thatcher was elected in '79, went in '83 and '87. Now they went in '92, but that was partly to give time to get Major to get his feet under the table anyway, because he didn't become leader until November '90, so he wasn't going to have an election 4 or 5 months later, or certainly in that. And it was the biggest mistake he could have made in some respects. But no, because he did win in '92. But I was just thinking things fell apart very quickly after that. But,
well, that's.
So he sat there in '92 going, I can't stand another 4 years. Well, it wasn't 4 years; it was 5.
Yeah, but that's another thing that they capture quite well, and they do it in shorthand, which is that Labour, at that time, were holding sort of victory parades and kind of very glam Hollywood gloss. Now, it's interesting that 5 years later the world is ready for that, and it does suit Labour with Blair at the helm. But they weren't ready for it with Kinnock. And the other thing is, at the time, the mood of the nation, I remember this even as a very precocious 12-year-old, was that, why is John Major on his soapbox? And I was kind of thinking, well, I'm 12 and I get this. The reason he's on his soapbox is that's the mood of the nation. The reason he's at a greasy spoon rather than holding a gigantic rally is we are a country in recession. And the majority of people get that that is cyclical and not necessarily the result of the vile evil Tories, even though their responses to that traditionally are less popular. The man himself, who genuinely comes from the more working class background, is the one who stands the better chance in this climate, however much they have to scrape it.
Campaign was absolute genius back then.
Yeah, in a way that it wasn't 5 years later.
The same thing off in '97, it couldn't.
No.
But funnily enough, and again, this may be projection, but a couple of times I saw him on like his soapbox, and he would say, "We're going to win," and I genuinely fucking believed he believed it.
Yeah.
And when he tried the sort of pale version of it in '97, you just knew the game was up. But I think
it was a tired brand, basically.
There's 2 things I like about it. Yes, it was. There's 2 things I like about when I look at this, they showed the Sheffield rally. Now, I think it was about a week before the election. They hired some arena in Sheffield, the Labour Party. This is what James is alluding to. And Kinnock came out and made a complete piss pot of himself.
We're all right. We're all right.
We're all right.
We're all right.
We're all right.
Yes.
Now, what I like about it is that the film showed it, but we didn't have any moralising from any of the characters saying to each other, that's what lost us the election, because it isn't.
Yeah.
What lost them the election, in my view, I was a little older than you back then, and my memory of it is where the polls really changed. Right, let's go back just one step very quickly. There is a perception that Labour governments always crash the economy. Now, it doesn't actually matter whether that's true. Only the perception matters. And what damaged the current opposition, if you like, is that they didn't nail that in 2010. They spent too long arguing over the right of succession that it has now become an accepted quote-unquote truth that Labour maxed out our credit card and they can't be trusted with the economy. There are so many shades of grey in that argument, it's untrue. It's probably not quite true, but to say it's complete bullshit isn't quite right either. But anyway, so 1979, you have the winter of discontent leading into it, the strikes, union, inflation up at like, I think at once it peaked at something like 27%, interest rates were up at 15%. My mother, people buying their first home and having to pay 15, 16% interest. Whose fault it was? Probably nobody's. It's just the way the world was at the time. But there was a perception that the unions were going in for beer and sandwiches every week at number 10 and basically saying this is what we want. And there was a perception that the unions were running the country and they were running into the toilet. We'd also had a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Actually, we had a load through the Macmillan governments as well. So it's not unusual retreated into their shell. Instead of like trying to modernise, they voted in Michael Foot. After that, they had Kinnock, who they didn't vote in as a big moderniser, but he turned into one. So by 92, there's a little bit of nerves still about whether Labour can be trusted with the economy. Now, you think a recession would play into their hands, but it didn't, because it's fragile. It's fragile. Do we want to give a fragile economy to them? And they shot themselves in the foot, because John Smith got up and did, completely without having to, an alternative budget. Where they said that they were going to raise the top rate of tax. The rates of tax at that time were 25 and 40, I think. I think it was during the next Parliament. What's he called? Kenneth Clark fought it down to like 23, 22, something like that. But it was 25 and 40 at the time. So the top rate of tax, 40p in pound. And they got up and said they presented this alternate budget as a government in waiting. They thought it would be a wise thing to do to show how responsible they were. But they said the top rate of tax would go up to 50, and they tanked in the polls right afterwards.
Okay, it cost them the election.
It scared Middle England. That's why they lost. But I have to say, it can't help walking out an arena and going, "We're all right."
Yeah,
that can't help.
Yeah, but the other thing they capture is the fact that the baton is then passed to John Smith, and it is a great performance by Frank Kelly because we talk about the structures of stories. Be it Star Wars, to some extent, some lesser extent Bond, but certainly in terms of sort of mythology and almost Greek tragedy. The Mentor, even Four Weddings and a Funeral, which I mentioned actually suitably in context. Just to go off on one.
Simon Callow in it, that you can feel the shadow of a heart attack looming over it.
Precisely, Dave. Yeah, you get the shadow that this guy is. They keep foreshadowing.
He's all jokes. He's red-faced and ruddy as hell.
Yeah.
We already know he's had a heart attack. And he sat on a train, like, drinking cans of beer and holding court. And the film isn't banging you over the head. It's not like he sat eating bacon sandwiches and, like, chain smoking.
Yeah, but it's there.
There's just enough there that you go, yeah, this guy's not necessarily going to be around.
And he's the father figure who is... And this is where, once again, they do it so quickly and with such complexity and kind of sleight of hand that it's so brilliant. They managed to capture the fact that, well, John Smith inherited the leadership, and therefore, prima facie, whatever everyone looks at it, he was an ambitious man. He was not, therefore, quite just the cuddly altruist as that he was presented as, and he knew that he had to, on the one hand, train up Blair and Brown, but also, on the one hand, I think maybe foresaw the clash that was going to happen, and B, perhaps even saw them as potential threats. Because there's another moment where Blair is asked direct, why didn't you stand against John Smith? And Brown is asked the same thing. Well, the fact is the leadership was more or less passed to him, and John Smith was doing okay in 1994 when suddenly, I remember the day it happened, and it was literally, I just couldn't believe it.
I've got a feeling school was like in session. It wasn't Easter or something.
Yeah, no, it was. It was the beginning of the summer term. It was sort of May, June, something like that. But what's interesting...
I just remember putting the TV on, and it had like, I think it was just before BBC, the news channel started. It used to be known as BBC News 24. But definitely we'd gone to the news room.
Yeah.
And somebody was being interviewed by the news person in the studio, not over BT or whatever. And they said, this is going to be a terrible blow to John. And you saw like a car arriving at a hospital or an ambulance or whatever it was. And I didn't clue in immediately because both the leaders of both parties were called John. I thought John Major had a heart attack to start with.
No, he's Superman. That doesn't happen unless they found kryptonite.
He's going to live forever.
Yeah, he's in good shape. He really is. He's serious. No, but he seriously is in good shape, Major. You know. But anyway, that aside. But yes, it was a shock, wasn't it? No one.
The Tories need more people like that, to be honest.
Yeah, they did. But no one saw it coming. And yet at the same time,
everyone's wise after the event because there was a lot in the papers then of showing a picture of him 2 years before and then, and he had like let his weight creep up again.
Yeah, but he got on a bike. I remember the day, the front cover of the Times. I don't know why I remember this. Actually, no, I'm going to explain why I remember it so clearly. The day, it's the front cover of the Times, I think, and it's a picture of John Smith on a bicycle. Was the photo they showed to say, look, he's dead. As in, okay, yes, he had a heart attack before, but to his credit, he had then gone on a health kick. And as I say, the tragic kind of clash between the inevitable and the preventable, the fact that it's going to happen. Then when you frame that in drama, obviously some subtle foreshadowing. I'm going to bring it up again alongside Four Weddings. My favourite, as you know, it was only a matter of time before I mentioned it. There's this cafe in Florence. Well, that's classic foreshadowing. You know where Alfred mentions it at the beginning, that there's this place where you know they're going to end up. Little more subtly done in the deal, but it's there. The sense that in dramatic terms, even if this were a fictional story, you have this idealized mentor figure, this Yoda, if you like. Well, not quite Yoda. This kind of Obi-Wan of the New Labour movement that's beginning to happen. But in order for that really to take off, dramatically, he has to die. Because it's the only way that you're going to galvanize these two opposing forces of nature, Blair and Brown, to A, clash, and then B, in some form come together to really make it happen properly. Because one gets the feeling that there was every danger. Let's say there's an alternate universe where Major had been successfully challenged, and you'd had a Portillo or someone like that, who had got ahead of the game and adopted the kind of the New Labour, slightly sleeker corporate stuff. I mean, I suspect their day was done anyway, but they'd have had a harder time of it, I suspect, maybe in retrospect, under Smith's leadership and his kind of honesty and he played the corporate game a little bit more, I think, than people led on, but he wasn't quite, as I say, that kind of corporate persona that Blair, and to some extent Brown, in his way, despite what people think, were able to play. And it was a lot to do with the zeitgeist and the sort of the look of the time. And another reason to mention Four Weddings isn't just the foreshadowing and the death of the mentor that kind of galvanizes the hero. Because Four Weddings is, okay, he's not saving the day, Charles, but he is a kind of a hero in that story. He's the lead figure. But Blair was quite obsessed, apparently, at the time with Four Weddings and a Funeral, because it was the film of the time. And, you know, we talk about Bond a lot, obviously. Hugh Grant, at the time, had suddenly come on the scene. If you look back at the body language of Hugh Grant around that time, and you look a little bit at the body language and the cadence of Tony Blair, they're not that dissimilar. They come on the scene at pretty much the same time, and I think one of the reasons I remember that time of year in '94 so well, it was the time when, this is how superficial I think my worldview is, it revolves around Bond to some extent, but there you have it, everyone knows it. There was the debate about who should be Bond, and Hugh Grant was in the frame for it. Four Weddings and a Funeral had premiered, and they work this into the film, which is they have an excellent performance. They have Dexter Flexter as Charlie Whelan, throws down a paper, and it's a picture of Liz Hurley on the front. He's saying, how can that have upstaged Gordon Brown? Well, at the time, even Blair himself, as he's admitted, I think, to people retrospectively, he kept going to see Four Weddings and a Funeral to get away from the leadership contest. He said, but I think also because he genuinely thought, this is the guy to copy. And we talk about the pervasive influence of film and film franchises. Well, number one, that zeitgeist, that kind of Curtis product, it's all there in Four Weddings. And any subsequent iteration of that is a version of it, in the same way as the new Star Wars or whatever is a iteration of that initial template. There is a kind of a hero's journey in there, which was mirroring maybe what was happening in the country at the time. And above all, a sense of style to it. All of the debates that we have about masculinity today and about, you know, what makes a man, well, a lot of that actually starts with that Curtis era, that Four Weddings and a Funeral thing, where the hero can actually be heroic because of his incompetence or his average everyman quality, provided that he's likable and presents well and has a certain Hollywood sheen or glam. Blair harnessed that in exactly the same way at exactly the same point. And it just happened that 2 weeks later they announced Brosnan instead of Hugh Grant. But there was certainly a feeling that there was something British, Four Weddings, the resurgence of Bond, Blair, and then 3 years later when Blair finally gets into power, that comes full circle with Britpop and
yeah, there's a resurgence of British music as well.
Yeah, Britpop and you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it was. I mean, if you talk about people we can identify with and everyday people and all that, well, Major was very everyday people, but he ran a government that was seen as a bit incompetent.
Yeah.
And all the people behind him came off as like backstabbing bastards,
including Portillo.
I just remember Portillo's a much nicer man now than he was then.
Yes, he genuinely had a voyage of discovery. He had a Damascene conversion, genuinely.
He did. Yeah. After he lost his seat, he's a very different man now. I mean, you see him get up at sort of the '95 conference as defence minister and talk, and he comes off as racist, frankly, which I never thought he was, by the way. But he was so dialed into the xenophobic rhetoric of a certain wing of that party. But I remember the party chairman at the time was Brian Mulwinning.
Oh God, yeah.
I read him coming on the TV because they just came off as not very nice people, and I don't expect them to be all lovely by any means.
Well, another franchise we touch on is, do you remember Alan Partridge, where he's giving the talk and he goes, you know what I can do? Sometimes I'll just take off my jacket, give my presentation like that. Well, there's this footage I remember that stuck out in my head of the 97, the final days of the election, and Dr. Brian Mawhinney was comparing, for want of a better term, one of those conservative conferences, and he whips off the jacket. I think he even, I hope I'm not slandering him here, but he even turns the chair back to front. I don't know if he actually does. You know that business of being cool by sitting on the chair back to front? I may be misremembering that, but there's certainly the business of, hey, look how cool we are. We're the Tories, we take off our coats.
Well, they came off as all about their own ambition now.
Yeah.
I just think some of that is through the prism of they've been in 16, 17, 18 years, depending on when we're talking about in this period.
But it's a very, but the thing that the deal gets across so well, and once again they do it with clarity, simplicity, a little bit, as you've pointed out, Dave, very well, the idea that they use archive footage, but they splice it with the narrative without undermining it.
Yeah, we don't see Kinnock and then see the guy playing Kinnock.
But what they get across is the Granita thing, that the crux of Granita, this Granita Pact, this restaurant called Granita, where Blair and Brown have a sit down, a kind of a high noon coffee and heat style between, you know, Pacino and De Niro face off, where they finally come to a deal about who should be leader. The thing that summarizes it from Blair to Brown, there's this moment where an actress from EastEnders, he says, well, and once again, we don't know how accurate that is, but walks into the restaurant and is recognized. And Blair is so at home there in a way that Brown isn't. But as Blair points out, that's the future. That's how you win elections. And the thing is, he's right. Because it is kind of what helped him win it.
Brown didn't know who that was.
Yeah.
Now, in some respects, I think there's a middle path between the two.
Yeah.
Because I found it's like, I mean, he might be genuinely a Newcastle fan, I don't know, because he was, his seat was up in the northeast. But whenever I saw Blair sort of heading a football with Kevin Keegan or going on about Newcastle, I'm just thinking, well, Newcastle were popular at the time, they beat Slade, the great Manchester United sort of thing that year. And I always felt that there was a middle ground between the two, because when Brown ended up as Prime Minister, I remember him saying something along the lines of, the Arctic Monkeys really sort of got him up in the morning, you know, and out of bed and all the rest of it. And when he was asked, he couldn't name a single Arctic Monkeys song. And I just thought then, it's not your fucking job. It's like when I see parents trying to like be in with their kids and stuff. It's not your fucking job. You know, you ought to have some awareness of pop culture. But I mean, I think I think it might be Blair who said this. He said, you know, you end up having to learn what pints of milk cost in case you're asked and stuff.
Yeah.
And I just think there's a part of me that thinks, why don't you just say, well, I don't carry money. I'm surrounded by Secret Service all the time, so I've got no fucking idea. When I last used to do it, it was this much. But of course they can't do that. There was a middle ground between the two.
And that's the irony, is that these architects of the third way, neither of them ultimately were able to embody that third way, which is between power and being the everyman, which is the key to it. But as a film, it's as a film. I mean, do you rate it as a film? The Deal.
Yeah, it was the best film I've seen before, to be honest with you.
Interesting, and it's a remarkably. It is, and it's available on 4 on demand. If you get Channel 4 on demand, or you can order it on DVD or whatever it is. They try.
I mean, what I'll say about it is, it's the most subtly written.
Yes.
It's the most balanced, and it's the most interesting topic. There's more grandstanding and less subtly made points in the films that follow.
Yes.
So The Deal's the strongest, but it's a very small and, in some respects, unremarkable piece. But it's all the better for that. Yeah,
it's basically a TV movie, and what's interesting is they try and repeat that outside of this arc. I did think about adding it to the list, but A, the list was getting big, and B, I can't physically watch it again. It was called Coalition, which they did. Once again, it's a Channel 4 thing. And trying to repeat all the beats of that. Well, the funny thing is, in trying to repeat the beats of movies that are about Blair and Brown, they actually show up the fact that the politicians in question were undone by trying to repeat the beats of Blair and Brown. To the extent, I think even Cameron and Osborne even referenced at some point, they said, no, there's been no Granita Pact between us. And you can think, guys, you're actually mythologizing recent history. You are playing the parts, rather than simply taking a bit here or a bit there. It's literally become like film franchise politics. This is where, you know, politics and film do overlap. We've got guys who are simply playing the part in exactly the same style. Well, one of the tricks we've talked about franchises, you've got to reinvent. Take some bits of it, sure, but don't do the same thing and expect, you know, the same result at the same time, because the world moves forward.
Yeah, and we learned that the hard way, because, I mean, there is a time, I mean, the big debate during certainly the first term of New Labour was the Euro and whether we should join it. Now, everything I've read tells me Blair desperately wanted to have branded, and all these 5 economic test nonsense they talk was just that, vague as possible to try and keep us out. But I do genuinely believe there is a period in time where Blair could have convinced the country of almost anything. There still would have been a good number that hated him, that's true of any politician, but he had a critical mass of people, and I think he could have taken us into the Euro. I'm not saying he should have, by the way, but I'm just saying, considering we're now a nation that's fallen out of Europe, we've only got to go back to within the last 20 years that I think he was stronger. He was persuasive enough and liked enough at one time that he probably could have got us into it. The problem is, Cameron comes along. Blair was very much about the power of persuasion. He was very, very involved in the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes.
The power of his own persuasion. He could talk to anyone, and he could talk to people that maybe even the public wouldn't want him to talk to because it's Tony Blair and we believe he's doing the best he can.
Gaddafi,
so
whoever,
the Good Friday Agreement is very, very... Gaddafi was a little later on, and that did raise a few more eyebrows. But certainly, at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, Blair could do no wrong, and I think people say, well, the Tories started that, and they did, but...
They couldn't have executed it with quite the aplomb. As I say, you know...
They had too much baggage, and they didn't have a Blair. Now, the problem is, Cameron comes along with the same faith in the ability to convince anybody of anything, because he's the heir to Blair.
But he wasn't, was he?
For Brexit, loses it.
Yeah, and he thought
referendum for Brexit, loses it.
Yeah, and he thought that would be his little Good Friday moment. I think he thought that he would have the same kind of, and he was desperate for a Blair-like moment. I mean, you know, I'm not. Once again, I don't think, in the same way as I don't think Blair is or was a villain, I don't think Cameron was a real villain. But his almost, I think he got the wrong end of the stick about what bits he was charged with copying.
That's his suicide.
Yeah, he had to cut the bit he was charged with copying from Blair was simply the youthful, likeable, slightly glossier presentation, a reinvention of the brand. That didn't mean copying the structure. You know?
I'm not sure. I mean, because when you think about it, actually, what was he needed for? What did we need a Cameron for instead of, say, a Ken Clark or a Michael Howard or something? Some of that's baggage, that Michael Howard was Home Secretary in the major government and seemed to make an art form of sounding as hard and fucking nasty as possible.
Yeah.
It was just his brand at the time. Actually, he was much, much more likeable as Tory leader than he ever was as a Home Secretary.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
And
yes.
And he actually did a little bit of work to do, because he changed the voting method as well, or he tried to change the voting method, because he's not stupid. He could see that the country were never going to vote for any independence.
Michael Howard was more youthful in his leadership of the Tories back in 2000 for that window than William Hague had been. Yeah, that's the funny thing about the Tories, is they keep getting the wrong guy to do the right job, or the right guy to do the wrong job. You know, like, because
if you look at Michael Howard,
yeah,
he followed Hague and Duncan Smith, two men who, whatever their pluses and minuses, would never ever have won an election unless they were up against a bunch of paedophiles or something.
Yeah.
I mean, Hague less so than Duncan Smith, because Hague was quite funny and stuff like that. But the fact is, they completely missed you. You had a Tory membership with an average age of about 64 years of age.
Yeah.
And they went for these people that the public would never go for. Cameron was required to detoxify the Tory brand.
Which, of course, he did.
Now, the two most toxic bit of the Tory brand are that they hate the poor, supposedly, and Europe. So that you can see how we end up having the referendum, because that's the final bit to sort of drain the poison. Unfortunately, if you ask a stupid question, you get a stupid fucking answer.
Interesting. And there was the rise of UKIP as well. I think he thought militarily almost, if I take away the weapon of UKIP, I will take away UKIP, and I will stop Tory voters, you know, going towards that. But yet, I think ultimately, unfortunately, although he did
actually, it wouldn't have happened under PR when you think about it.
No, and I think the other thing is, although he did detoxify the brand and he did get them into power, it was narrow on both occasions. Let's not forget, he didn't actually outright blast Blair Brown out of the water. In fact, there are some who believe he
should have in 2010.
Yeah, and then the second time.
2010 is why I think 2010 is why Theresa May fought such a lackluster campaign.
Yeah.
Because in 2010, Labour were finished. Frankly, I mean they could have won in late 2010 to in 2007, but they weren't going to win in 2010.
No.
This was before UKIP really got a handle in the polls, so it was still a two-horse race, kind of.
Yeah.
Got thrown into sharp relief with the whole "I agree with Nick" bollocks. But Cameron gave in and did the leaders' debates. They did three of them with the three main parties, as it was then, so Labour, Tory, and Lib Dem. The reason Nick Clegg comfortably won the first one by any measure, not just charm. He actually had the better night. Brown tanked all of them. He was rubbish at that sort of thing. But Cameron didn't noticeably win strongly. And when Linton Crosby came along to manage, well, he's managed their subsequent campaign. He did manage that one as well. But they won't let Tory leaders make the same mistake, which is why we've not had the three leaders together, or whatever cut of that it would be.
2.5. Because Clegg finished the Liberal Democrats as well by trying to be Blair. Anyone who's trying to be Blair from here on finishes rather than reboots the brand that they're trying to save. That's the irony of it, is that this is the legacy of Blair.
I only feel a bit sorry for the Lib Dems on the basis that the idea is that the public thinking is they've gone in with the Tories, and that's a fundamental betrayal of their sort of liberal, progressive ideas. Okay?
Yeah.
I understand that entirely, but the whole basis, and probably their strongest desire, is proportional representation and coalition government. So,
yes.
And compromise.
The third way.
The Liberal Democrats, by their very nature, are the type of party who exist where they should be willing to work with the Tories.
Yes.
So I feel a bit sorry. It wasn't. It might have been a betrayal of the progressive left, if you like, but it certainly wasn't a betrayal of their principles. I don't think.
But the long and the short of it. The long and the short of it is, you take all of those threads together, from Cameron to Clegg to Brown, whoever it is, and for all of the revisionist flaws that have been identified and that may be unidentified subsequently as revisionist history reinvents in the next few hundred years or whatever. Fact of the matter is, Blair had an unbeatable ability, a literally inimitable ability to persuade the nation of what it needed to, for him, whatever was on his mind, needed to accept. And the one thing that I think that The Queen as a movie does particularly well, and it's important to, I suppose, remember this as everyone's been marking the 20th anniversary of Diana's death. If the royals had not taken Blair's advice at the time, I think we were definitely looking at a mass hysteria riot, as in onto the palace gates. And from that, God knows where it would have gone. And I think the fact that Blair intervened in the manner that he did, and this is one of the things that movie does show particularly well, is why we still have a monarchy in this country. Why we may even still have a country. Because it wouldn't have been just the monarchy that they'd have gone after. The masses. Because I say the masses, I'm not one of them. I mean, I was only 17, so I was immersed in my own little world of A-levels and, trying to pursue unattainable women. I've moved on, of course, from all that. But, it didn't affect me quite as badly as some. I do remember I was at a party with the grown-ups a couple of days later, and there was some fella mouthing off. He said, Princess Diana's death is no different from any other Warwick woman. And I said, just stop for 1 second there. I said, actually it is, because this is a national treasure, a symbol. And this is also a young woman who has now, left 2 kids without a mother. And a day ago, a surgeon held that woman's heart in their hands. And he shut up. And I was thinking, God, I just remembered it recently because I thought, what a ballsy 17-year-old I was.
He remembered attempts to revive her. It did involve hands inside her chest.
Well, exactly. So that's, the imagery was pretty blunted. But what I didn't feel, Dave, was a sense that that she had been taken from us by anything other than an unfortunate coincidence. What I did feel was that perhaps there was a tragedy of, I mentioned earlier on about inevitability versus preventability. Well, this is somebody who relentlessly foresaw or foreshadowed her own death to some extent. That's also why I don't believe in any kind of conspiracy theory, because for God's sake, if it were one of those, they would not have gone for such a messy way of doing it. This is not the way that people get murdered.
Why would you wait until a messy public divorce with an enormous payoff,
Yeah.
and her in the press going on about how she lost her HRH and all
Yeah.
that kind of shit?
It wouldn't have happened.
I find the whole Diana thing quite difficult to talk about, not for any sense of grief, more for the sense that I was never a big fan of hers. But I appreciate that like a lot of people were, so, and I don't really want to hurt or upset anybody.
The symbolism is there.
I found it very difficult to condemn the royal family for lots of reasons. One of them was the Queen at the time was what, 70, something like that. Brought up in the film addresses is brought up in duty and not talking and following protocol and all the rest of it. She didn't understand the nation she was presiding over. Well, I was 20 years old, or 19 years old, and working class, and didn't understand the nation I was fucking part of, and I was much better placed to be so than she was. So I don't know what people really expected from the royal family.
Yeah.
They had Diana year after year causing the press, for good or ill, and however she was or wasn't treated, for about 2 years up until she died. Every time she appeared on screen, my teeth fucking itched. I was just so sick of, can someone shut this fucking woman up? And of course, it happened in the most tragic of circumstances. Now, before I go any further down that path, just to echo what James says, the woman was 36 years of age. She had sons who were at the time 15 and 13, something like that. Yeah. This was an enormous tragedy. Unreservedly, forget what I thought of her. What I really struggled with was that sort of, I found it a bit, you know when you get to Christmas, and if you aren't constantly fucking jerking yourself silly over the fact it's Christmas next week, someone will say, bar humbug.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it was like. That's what it's like was like when Diana died. I'd switch on the TV. I worked in a pub at the time, and I walked into the pub in the morning, not knowing she died because I hadn't switched TV on. And one of the barmaids was in tears, and I was like, "What's up?" And she told me it, and she looked shocked when I wasn't. I was surprised, but I wasn't like crying or anything.
Because it's not your mum, it's not your wife, it's not your.
Then we had the funeral, and the minute silence and all that shit, and everyone in the pub's crying, and I'm like, I don't recognise this emotion. This is someone you don't fucking know. And then finally, I'd switch on the TV, and they had those books of condolences, and people were queuing for like 12 hours. Honestly, they were coming on the news and saying the queue at the moment is estimated at 12 hours. And I'd see some woman coming out of the queue, i.e. she just either just signed or was just being called in to sign, and she had a toddler in a pushchair. And I'd be like, well, I know it's summer, but you've just put a toddler through 12 hours so you can sign a book for somebody I find quite narcissistic that you didn't even fucking know.
Yeah.
And I did not
but it was,
my country.
But that was the point, was that the country...
James, it wasn't the fact, hang on a minute,
yeah.
It wasn't the fact that everyone was showing their feelings, because I'm far from a stiff upper lip guy.
Yes, I know.
Something's upsetting. I couldn't understand, and still don't to some degree, understand what it was about Diana that made people so upset. Shock and upset, and maybe even a tear I could get. But for about a month period, this country was in fucking paroxysms of despair. And the fact that the Queen didn't immediately tune into that is no surprise to me. And the fact that Blair did tune into it shows what an extraordinary, talented man he was, because one of his aides, I mentioned Andrew Rawnsley earlier on, but he made like a show for, I think it was Dispatches a few years ago, and I think it was called something like Blair Did It All Go Wrong or something like that. And one of his aides was being interviewed, and he said that he went into, it's slightly reworked in the film, you do see this, but you don't see it quite in this setting. He said he went into a newsagent's to buy a newspaper, and it was Tony Blair's famous bit from outside church, because she died overnight on the Saturday into Sunday, and he'd gone to church, and he came out and he gave that People's Princess stuff, and the guy said, and the guy is probably about, no, he can't be my age now, because he wouldn't be working for the government at 20, but he would have been very young at this point, and he turned around to say to the shopkeeper, Christ, that's a bit over the top, isn't it? Because he immediately panicked, thinking Tony's really overdone that, and the shopkeeper was crying. And it was like Tony Blair read a mood that most of us didn't.
But then that's the thing, is that he was part of that mood, and I think the other thing is it's a little bit chicken and egg. Did he just represent a zeitgeist and kind of cash in on it, or did he actually help to drive and create it? But looking at the cinematic parallel,
Somebody's been quite, I think, well, yeah, I mean, I've been quite complimentary about him tonight in a lot of ways in terms of his skill.
but that's because because Dave, they're empirical facts. It's an empirical fact that
I saw that speech, and like it was one of those moments where you didn't figuratively throw up a bit in your mouth. I just thought that's fucking sick making, but the public loved it. And Tony and William Hague spoke very soon afterwards, and couldn't hope to match that.
No, as he knew himself. So, he's constantly he's been pretty honest and self-deprecating about that. But if we look at the sort of the cinematic parallel to it, we talk a lot about the Brosnan era, and you have, cited many of the things that Pierce did very well, which was to maintain the franchise and to kind of give it that gloss and so on. But that in terms of substance, when it tries to deliver on substance, it's a postscript, it doesn't quite work, it's a bit rushed. What's interesting about 1997 is that as a year, and we've mentioned this already, is the idea that there's a resurgent Britain, Britpop, Union Jacks, presence in the world, a sort of a sense of cool. The only other time I can...
World.
Yeah, Spice Girls, they were on top of the world. The only other time I can think of that coming close to the Olympics and so on, and how it coincides with Bond. Well, Tomorrow Never Dies isn't necessarily one of the regarded movies as a piece of cinema, but in terms of capturing that mood of the time, which was Britain on top. One of the reasons I think people buy into that movie of Britain being as important as to be selected even for a war against China is the fact that in that year, and partly under the force of Blair, who's very much a sort of a Brosnan era politician, you get that sense that Britain could do this. Yeah, it is important. And the other thing is, the villain in Tomorrow Never Dies is the media. And the 90s, I think people forget this at their peril. As a decade, yes, there were still terror threats, certainly before the Good Friday Agreement, and so on. And there was still variations of what became Al-Qaeda around then. But it was a relatively safe decade. The world was not. I think the world was safer, certainly in the mid-90s, than it is now. But we still wanted all of the trappings of warfare, of importance, of a national mission. And I think the thing about the Diana death was that for that split second, the nation felt a kind of a blitz spirit mobility, but there wasn't a villain to go after, and there wasn't an actual war to fight. And I think that the war on that day, lots of people were desperately trying to attack the media as a branch.
She was murdered, though.
Yeah.
Talk about there's no villain to come after. The royal family took some right shit after that.
Yeah, but the royals and also the media, the paparazzi and so on.
It wasn't helped by the fact Fayed kept on about how Tony was murdered.
Yeah, but the point is, people
take no encouraging at all.
People were storming barricades, and Blair prevented that going further. And the film, The Queen, I think, captures that with the same clarity and economy and vigour as the deal did about what initially started and then ultimately ended the Blair Brown thing.
Where it falls below the deal is that there's a bit near the end where I think it might be Cherie says to Tony, "You've saved the monarchy," and I think you don't have to say that in dialogue. It's a blunter film, but then it's made for a worldwide audience.
It's a bigger budget affair, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the vagaries of Diana, because you can actually be a lot more positive about Diana than I am, and really have liked her and loved her, in fact, after a fashion, but still acknowledge flaws, or at least inconsistencies in the way she behaved around the press. Or you don't necessarily have to like her and hate the royal family. There's shades of grey in all of this that the film just doesn't have the time to capture. And it's going after a worldwide audience that basically says Diana's a tragedy and the royal family don't get it. And it even has them saying things behind closed doors that are like, "Don't let the boys hear you say that." Like, what's she done now? And well, as long as the press were there. And whilst I suspect some of those things would have been said behind closed doors because Diana drove them to fucking distraction at times. There's no evidence any of that was said, and I think it's kind of, I think it comes very close to tying them with the wrong brush.
Yeah, and it's also melodramatic. It's quite soap operatic stuff, isn't it? Really.
Well, they cast James Cromwell, which is slightly odd casting. They cast him as Prince Philip. Now, there's two things about James Cromwell. Firstly, he's American, which I found a little bit odd as casting, but also he's about 6'6" or 6'7", something like that. Big, imposing, cold figure he's played as in this. They love their grandchildren. By that they mean Diana's two boys. But the warmth is all coming from the Queen's side of it, without trying to soft soap her, because at no point does Queen Elizabeth really do public feelings. There's no doubt she would have found it unbelievably difficult to get in front of a camera to talk about Diana. Phrases like speaking as a grandmother were put in by Alistair Campbell to try to humanise her a bit. They had no precedent for this. Because there was no precedent for Diana.
No. It is beautifully acted by Helen Mirren. You know, she does capture that conflict. And once again, when we talk about, there are some moments of dialogue which spell things out too much, but there are little looks that she gives that simply show that conflict of I want to be steely and duty-bound, but I'm not without heart, but I don't want to bear that heart, and nor should I have to. And she manages to capture that in
also,
looks.
Yeah, because it would have been very easy to have it one of two ways. Either the royal family are a bunch of pantomime villains and poor Diana, they've driven her to her death. Whereas the film makes it quite clear it's paparazzi. I mean, the moment they get into the car, they're twos up on the bikes, aren't they? Getting after her, one to take the phone, one to ride it. It's painted very much as a tragic accident born out of circumstances, which I've no reason to believe it isn't. Now, the two ways of going at it that would have been wrong would have been either the royal family are heartless, didn't care, blah, 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 blah. The other way would have been to paint the Queen as privately kind of devastated, but unable, because of the generation she comes from, to show that and communicate that to a public that are wounded. And the film didn't go for either cliche.
No.
It didn't actually strongly hint at a state of mind at all, other than confusion as to how this has all come about and how everything she's been bred to do now doesn't work, doesn't fit the playbook, and it carefully paints. Blair doesn't get into domestic politics very much, but it does talk about Blair as a moderniser. Well, in broad strokes, possibly. In the detail, he actually wasn't anything like as much as a moderniser as we maybe expected he would be.
No.
But it is about the fact that the film is telling us there is a completely fresh skill set that's now required for this.
Interesting. It's beautifully filmed, isn't it? I mean, it is beautifully photographed. It shows Scotland beautifully.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I watched it right after The Deal, which was a TV film.
Yeah.
And also, you'd lent me them, and the Deal was on DVD and The Queen was on Blu-ray. So it was all for things like that. It was always going to look terrific. But for a film that's largely London-based, I think it was absolutely terrific. I'm just looking to see who lensed it, actually.
There's a bit of Skyfall to that. I don't know why I was reminded of Skyfall, but the sort of the lingering.
It's colour palette.
Yeah, the lingering shots of.
She's at Balmoral. She's at Balmoral when it happens.
Yeah.
So you see her out deer hunting and stuff. That's where you're getting that from.
Right.
But I'm just looking to see what else he lensed. He shot Dark Water, which is a very.
What's his name again?
Alfonso Beato.
Right.
He hasn't shot anything for a while. But looking at films I know and I've seen, there was this. Before this, he did Dark Water, which is like a cringy horror film with Jennifer Connelly in. That's got kind of a cool cut. He did The Fighting Temptations, View from the Top, Ghost World. What else?
Scarlett Johansson's
first
film, isn't it?
Those are the best known things. But yeah, it's certainly a good looking film. It's a well written film. Pound for pound, given it's got more ambition than The Deal in terms of audience reach, running time, and everything else. For what it's trying to do, it's not as good as The Deal. But it's
it does its job.
I'm glad I've seen it. That was my first viewing.
Now, Peter Morgan, who wrote that, I mean, I mentioned Skyfall, he actually wrote a treatment for what became Skyfall shortly after this, in fact. And I think it's available in, there was a book written which is a very comprehensive history of the Bond films. Damn me for not remembering the name of it. It's a huge, big one. Is it Chowdhury wrote it? Who's the guy who wrote it?
Oh, you're on about Some Kind of Hero.
Some Kind of Hero, yeah. And in that book, somehow, there is a reference to what became Skyfall and Peter Morgan's treatment for it. But one of the things, I mean, it's an interesting piece. I think the only thing that they retained ultimately was the death of M. And of course, Judi Dench has played Queen Victoria in a similar way to as Helen Mirren has become associated with certain iterations of Morgan's take on Queen Elizabeth. And of course, the Netflix series The Crown, which is going to run and basically cover each decade. Each series will be a decade of the Queen's run. Will probably cross over with the same issues at some point, because when they get to decade number or whatever, however long the series goes on, at some point they will have to deal with the very things that the Queen has done in shorthand. They'll have a slightly longer reign to do it on, and they've got Matt Smith, who the former Doctor Who is a very interesting take on Prince Philip in it, and I think it's he's a good historical writer, Morgan, and that takes us into the special relationship, which is the close of the trilogy. You think this is the weakest, do you, of the three? No? Yeah. I mean, a lot of people feel that way. I mean, yeah.
I do, I think. I think it's because it lacks a single focus in the same way. I mean, it's got a focus. The focus is the relationship between Blair and Clinton, Bill Clinton.
Mm.
It starts very promisingly because you can see Blair trying to learn as much from Clinton as possible. And you can see Clinton looking forward to meeting Blair and looking forward to working with Blair and taking Blair's election win as a done deal, which, let's be honest, it was. It's like a football match, but the Tories were like 17-0 down at half-time.
Yeah.
There's no way the Tories were going to win that election. But as dramatised, he's quite excited because he thinks it's a bit like... I'm trying to think of the name of it, but there was a run of comics, I don't know if they still go now, and I forget what they're called, but it's an international sort of franchising of Batman, that there's like Batman is all over the world in the body of different people.
It's a really, Batman, I think it's just called Batman Incorporated or Batman International, isn't it?
Batman Incorporated, I think it was. But I think it's the same principle here, that it was wonderful for his ego to see him being aped. Just as I'm sure Blair must have looked across at Cameron occasionally and thought, well, I must have done something right, you know? But at this point, Blair is notionally on the same side. In fact, he probably had more in common with the US Democrat than he did with his own Labour Party, generally, in terms of his general politics. He's far softer of the left than the Labour Party had been for generations before. I was quite taken with, to start with Dennis Quaid's take on it, because a wonderful takeoff of Bill Clinton. And also the casting had been fairly consistent from the Queen, so we've now got Cherie and Tony again. It's the same people.
Is it Helen McCrory?
Like
Is it Helen McCrory as Cherie?
Helen McCrory, who those listening, she headed up the committee in Skyfall at which Judi Dench reads her poem. The chair of that was Helen McCrory, and she's married in real life to Damian Lewis, and she plays Cherie Blair in the last two entries in this trilogy, if you like. So it started all very well. I thought, because I know from reading things like Servants of the People that when they got to Costa, the sort of scales fell from Blair's eyes quite a lot about Clinton. They still remained fairly simpatico, but he thought Clinton was quite weak around Kosovo, and he was the one pushing for it. The film captures some of that, and definitely, but for what is meant to be a special relationship, past the first scene, the film doesn't even sell me they really like each other that much. They kind of fall out quite quickly. Clinton is painted a bit pantomime-y, I think. I think he's quite... He's not far away from being the villain of the piece in this. And whereas the deal has the constant anchor of Granita, even though you're not seeing Granita except the build-up at the start and it finishes there, it's the anchor around which the story is sort of, framed. Mixing my metaphors there. But
Yeah, no, I get it, and I think the Queen has the Queen and the deal have an
That
event.
week after her death,
Yeah.
it's a focused bit of time. The special relationship covers 4 years, really, 5 years, really, 6, 7 years, really, depending on how you look at it. Because it starts with a sequence of Blair going to some sort of conference about how they won the election. I've got a feeling that's 94.
Yeah.
You've got him meeting him at the White House, but that's a year before he's elected, so that has to be 96. But the meat of the film is 97 to 2001.
Yep.
In fact, 2000, because it's up to kind of the election more than him being sworn in. And so it just doesn't have the same focus at all. And I didn't enjoy it anywhere near as much, even though theoretically, on paper, it just said, here are the topics for the 3 films. I would have thought I prefer this to the Queen, but I didn't like it very much.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. Yeah, I think Quaid does a competent Clinton. I think there are moments where he.
It's one note.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
I think there are.
When you first see it, you go, "Well, that's Dennis Quaid. He looks like him." And wow, the voice is spot on. And then you realise that it's like watching Will Smith play Ali. Ali had lots of different voices for different mood. I mean, it's his voice, but it sounds different whether he's tired, angry, happy, laughing, aggressive, whatever. Dennis Quaid had one take on Clinton, and he does it in every scene, and it's kind of a bit annoying after a while.
I think he captures quite well the sense that, I don't know, in the kind of way that he like a head boy who has someone with a bit of a man crush on him in a lower year or something. He's got that sense that Blair is looking up to him, and initially he finds that endearing and interesting, and he's happy to help. But there are just moments, and they do capture this quite well, where he's starting to get almost impatient with Blair, either on the one hand sucking up too much initially, and then pushing it too far, trying to push him into a direction he wasn't comfortable, trying to pretend there's a friendship there that isn't quite as strong as, but Clinton will make the call or whatever and hang up when Blair wants more, But I don't think it's necessarily the most subtle of performances in terms of getting the essence of the character. I once was very lucky to bump into Chelsea Clinton. I was in Oxford. She was there at the same time. And most people apparently were quite cautious about going up to the president's daughter. As I say, this is a younger me, so I didn't really have any such qualms. I'm James Murphy. Who cares? And I went up to her, and we ended up having a sandwich together on a park bench. And we ended up talking about films. And I talked about a film called Primary Colours, which is a thinly disguised take on the Clintons.
Love it.
Yeah,
well, she. John Travolta
and Emma Thompson.
Emma Thompson.
And
Adrian Lester and others.
Yeah, and
Hagman.
And who? Who was?
Barry Hagman's in it.
Yes, he is.
Barry Hagman's in it. We see it. The lead, if you like, is Adrian Lester.
Yeah, he's a sort of way-in character. But I said I think they need to do a different version of the actual Clintons, not some thinly disguised version. And she said, okay, who would you cast? And I said, well, to play Bill Clinton, I would go for either Richard Gere, because of a kind of a brief physical resemblance, similar kind of hair and posture.
You don't need to make him up.
Yeah, and second, there's...
Put all 15 pounds, you're done.
Yeah, but second also, Richard Gere was very good at playing corporate leaders who would get maybe a little bit out of their depth in a deal or something like that, or foreign policy or whatever. There was Red Corner he did, and Pretty Woman and stuff. He was tending to play very much that sort of thing. And I said, and the other guy I could picture was Christopher Walken, and I think that did make it up, because Christopher Walken, when he's a villain in movies, he does this thing of, when he's about to make a threat, he pauses and puts his hand generally to his mouth when he's trying to tell you that he's about to kill you. And Bill Clinton would do a very similar thing when he was threatening any kind of foreign policy action. I've said on a number of occasions, they've been warned about what's happening in Kosovo, or whatever it is. And he put his hand to his mouth exactly the same way. And even his autobiography, I'll talk about Alec Baldwin's autobiography, or Alan Partridge, needless to say, I had the last laugh.
I've got it. I haven't read it all, but I've got it.
Well, you go back to it, Dave. I'm telling you, every chapter pretty much almost does end with, I had the last laugh there. I mean, he doesn't say it all the time, but it's that kind of thing, like, I got away with it, but still very competent. So
Clinton and Blair had one great similarity in that, and it's happening to me as I get older. I'm no less political than I ever was.
Yeah.
And my opinions haven't wildly changed, but I'm far less partisan as I get older.
Yeah.
Because you meet good people who vote the other way and stuff. Blair said in his memoirs about Claire Short, he said Claire Short's biggest problem, he said, was that when someone disagreed with her, she thought they were evil, not just wrong. And what he had was an ability to reach across the aisle. Now, as much as you might say, well, he was a Tory anyway, no, he wasn't. And the fact is, Clinton was the same, because I haven't got to the Kenny Starr stuff yet, so I'm sure that's very different. But he will talk about going somewhere. And he said it was at that point I was with their future governor, Mike Huckabee. If you know Mike Huckabee, he's conservative as shit. Most Democrats wouldn't share a stage with Mike Huckabee. Mike Huckabee's daughter is currently the White House press secretary, by the way, Sarah Sanders Huckabee. Bill Clinton has, and I think Blair talks about this as well, has an innate interest in people. And he said, funnily, I think Blair said so sometimes it manifested itself in other ways. But it wasn't an innate interest in people that Clinton would just sit and talk to people, whoever they were.
Yeah.
And so that's what I found interesting about what I've read so far, that when he's talking about someone, he isn't talking about hardline bastard Republican this person. He's talking about this person.
Yeah.
And if the context of what he's talking about has no relation to the fact that there's some nasty bastard, then that's not what he's talking about. And it became very noted when he was talking about Huckabee, because don't forget, back in the 90s, the whole Republican Party were out to nail that man.
Yeah. But then he kind of, to some extent, made that happen. Yeah, I mean, A through being incredibly popular and difficult to beat, which made him a target, but B through supplying them, particularly that right-wing conservative lobby, with what they needed to at least to try and impeach him. But then back to the Chelsea thing very briefly, she said, well, who should play my mum? And I said, Sharon Stone. It's the only person I could think of doing it. And that really did make laugh. Now, that was the end of the chat, because the Secret Service then removed me. No, they didn't. But I judged that was kind of towards the end of the chat, so I sort of walked off. But it's a lovely memory. But what's interesting is that there are other actors and actresses who could have played the parts equally well. I think Quaid does an okay job. Who is it? Stockard Channing? No, who plays Hillary? Let's have a look.
Hope Davis.
Yeah, and she's very good. Physically, it's a good approximation, but actually, ironically enough, less of an impression. She's not just doing an impression.
Slightly too young, if anything. But there is a bit where they're sat in the Oval Office talking, and they're talking about tactics and all the rest of it. And she really captures Hillary in that one scene.
Yeah. But I think the strength of the film overall.
Basically, James, you've sent me 4 films, and I've enjoyed all of them, but this was like the least of the 4 for me.
Okay. Well, I think for me the strength of the special relationship is this, not where it does go, because yes, it covers accurately, I presume, to whatever extent, the sort of the bromance between Blair and Clinton, but the darker side of that, which was that to some extent that was meant more to Blair than it did to Clinton, and partly as a reflection of that, but partly because Blair genuinely wanted to push for more action on Serbia, he then pushes Clinton into that action, which damages the relationship. And it shows the beginnings of where Blair is willing to go. And it does a little bit like The Deal in the sense that it shows that moment of him snapping. I think there's a moment of him in lavatories.
That might be the point where he effectively lost his cherry. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't just mean on Kidney. I don't just mean, well, that's why Iraq happened. I mean that we've already talked about how he ended up much less interested in what people thought of him than when he started. In that, had he decided to try to fight another election, then yes, he still wants to be popular, but he became much more about doing what he thought was right.
Yeah, and I think as I said earlier on, I understand why.
Terrible consequences, but compared to the relative lightweight that took possession of number 10, I can't. There's a part of me that respects that, but I do wonder if the first step on that path is standing up to the American president in the Oval Office.
Yes, absolutely, because it makes you feel powerful. And I think that's another great thing about the film, to some extent, is that one of the reasons they haven't done a 4th that deals with the Iraq and the downfall, and sort of Blair the later years, in the same way as they do with Churchill, with lots of various stages of Churchill, is they don't need to. Because at the end of the special relationship, there's just that one scene in the kitchen where Clinton is asking Blair, well, what are you planning to do with this Bush administration? Considering that everyone had expected Al Gore to win it, or a lot of people had anyway.
Al Gore was a clear favourite.
Yeah, but Blair sort of says, well, I'm gonna do, work with him. I want to stay on I want to stay at the big table. And Clinton, there's just a look. Once again, it's good acting by Quaid. He just gives a look as if to say, well, actually, that just shows, therefore, that your interest is not actually about being a third-way politician in power, as it is as just being in power. And it therefore doesn't matter who is in the White House, so long as you're getting a chip in the game, if you like.
Just before we sort of leave Blair directly,
yeah.
There's a podcast out there called The Political Party, run by Matt, what's he called? I've got to find his name now, hang on a second. It is, let me just find, The Political Party is Matt Ford.
Right.
Now, he interviews a politician pretty much every month. It's on stage somewhere, so what will happen is you'll do a little bit direct to sort of the microphone to say, it was a good night or whatever, and then you'll hear him come out on stage and you'll do a bit of politics-based stand-up, and then you'll say, in the second half we'll be interviewing, and then whoever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And for 45 minutes to an hour, he'll interview people. Now, Matt Ford is unashamedly New Labour, but he's interviewed, I think last time out he interviewed William Hague, he's interviewed David Davis, he's interviewed, oh my God, what's he called? The guy Tim Farron, he's interviewed Nick Clegg, and so on. Anyone who's anyone, Kinnock, whoever.
We're all right.
He interviewed Tony Blair. Well, he interviewed Tony Blair fairly recently.
Is Blair that accessible? Can you literally? Could we? Do you think Blair, now that he's got this?
To set it up, and then, well, no, it took a while to set up, and
right.
He couldn't pre-announce who it was for security reasons.
Right.
And all he says in his stand-up bit is, be reasonable, basically, to his audience, i.e., even if you hate this guy, he's come here to talk to us. Yeah. And Blair talks really well, as you would expect. He's still deeply charming once you actually forget everything and just listen.
Yeah.
But he's asked, he said, he said that he's always got some degree of, empathy for the current Prime Minister, because he's done the job, he knows how hard it is. And he said that, if Donald Trump gets in, so I think Donald Trump hadn't been elected by this point, but he said if it is Donald Trump, he said, that's what I'd be doing. Your job is to get relatively close to the US president. That's the job. That's what's required. And, because he's asked about, your party wanted Al Gore to win. He said, well, yeah, I'm a Democrat too. He said, but once that was the situation, I got as close as possible. The difference was when I think he came to be re-elected, Bush. And of course, everyone's like, thank God we can get him out. I think by then, Blair wanted him to stay, because I think Blair realised the relationship worked for them, but also he felt that what they were doing in foreign affairs was in some way important. Yeah.
God himself had asked him to do it.
The Political Party is a really good podcast, but listen to the Tony Blair episode. There's 2 on there, actually, because I think he appeared on his sort of TV version, but they're worth listening to.
I shall put them in the show notes. And that leads us...
really was a win back. The Neil Kinnock one's awful.
Well, that leads us into the last one, which is sort of the fictional cousin to all of these, which is the Ghost, or as you point out, the Ghost Writer, whichever it's called in particular territories. I don't know why they varied that, but thoughts on it?
Well, it's called the Ghost. It's called the Ghost in British territories. I thought it was called that, then I saw it called the Ghost Writer somewhere, and got myself terribly confused.
Yes.
This is a Roman Polanski film. It's mixed feelings about it, really.
I'll bat off then. I'll start the batting. I think it's it does
somewhere with that. You start, actually.
It does what Polanski, late era Polanski, does terribly well, which is to set up a lot of atmosphere and a lot of tension at the beginning towards the middle, and then suddenly it burns itself out to the extent that around the middle, when our hero, our investigative journalist, played by Ewan McGregor, is probing a kind of a conspiracy. You don't know why he's bothering his ass to do it, because he could quite easily have just played along and got himself out of there. The stakes for him don't make sense, because we're not sold on him being an altruist, and we're not sold on him having
just write the fucking book.
Yeah.
Just write the fucking book or leave.
Yeah.
Or say, look, I'm not getting enough access to Adam Lang. I'm out.
Yeah. So Adam Lang is a very thinly disguised Blair. I think the other thing is, I actually think it's among Pierce Brosnan's best performances. But I think one of the reasons he does it so well is that the parallels between, if you like, his Bond is a Tony Blair Bond. He's a bit of everything.
Yeah.
And
I actually don't think he's that good in it, but we'll come to that.
Okay, he's certainly funny in it. And all they think I am is a fucking actor. And you're kind of thinking, Pierce, I don't think anyone was calling you an actor. Yeah.
The bit that really threw me off, for those who haven't seen it, do see it, it's worth seeing. It's very lesser Roman Polanski as far as I'm concerned, but it's worth seeing. No one's that good in it, except Olivia Williams, who's great in everything. But Ewan McGregor can't do accents. He just can't. How many films do we have to see him try it in there? But anyway, he's invited. Adam Lang is a former British Prime Minister. We don't know how long he's been out of office, but if he's a Blair analog, still 3 or 4 years, he's about Blair's age in real life and in the film. Because I think they were both born the same year, actually.
Yeah, they're both 64.
Very close together. Yeah, they're both 1953 births, aren't they? So he's been out of office, and his version of Iraq is that he gave people suspected of war crimes over to the Americans to torture against what the International Criminal Court had said. The International Criminal Court had said that he's basically under investigation for war crimes. But there's several shades to this. Firstly, he's living in America to avoid charge because the International Criminal Court is not recognised there. The only other places it isn't recognised, like Israel, North Korea, and a couple of other places. But the first thing that occurred to me is what a parallel with Roman Polanski himself, because Roman Polanski has now lived in Europe for years because he's wanted for statutory rape in the United States, because back in the 70s he had sexual relations with a 13-year-old girl. And if you ever read descriptions of that, and they are out there, the original court case, there's a bit more to it than that, and he does not come off out of that very well. So there's a little bit of that, running away from justice. The director's done that. Also, he hasn't run away to like LA or something and sat by a beach. He's run away to Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, I think it is. So it's cold and rainy.
This is Adam Lang, not Polanski. Yeah. In the film, he's yeah.
He's married to his childhood sweetheart, not his childhood sweetheart, his college sweetheart.
Same
played
difference.
by Olivia Williams, probably still best known for. Let me think. She was in The Sixth Sense as Bruce Willis's widow. But yeah, she's been in.
Spoiler! You've just spoiled the film. Ooh. If they don't know it by now.
When I say Bruce Willis's widow, forget I said that.
Yeah.
He.
Bruce Willis is not dead.
So he wants to write his memoirs, and he needs a ghostwriter to do it with him or for him, whichever way you want to put it. There was a guy who was doing this and was washed up on the beach dead. So at the start of the film, Ewan McGregor is interviewed in London with his agent about taking over the project. He's quite keen to do it, but he's also, you get the impression if they say no, then fine, which speaks into James's issues earlier that, well, if the stakes aren't that high, why don't you walk out? He definitely wants it, because he says, look, I'm not a political guy, I'm the right person for this, because I've written this, that, and the other. He gets the job, and he ends up over at Martha's Vineyard. The other sort of big hitter in the cast is Kim Cattrall, who plays Adam Lang's PA, and it's strongly implied they are sexually involved.
Yeah.
And Pierce Brosnan is kind of, it's funny, you call it the ghost writer. Pierce Brosnan's a bit of a ghost through the film. You don't see a lot of him.
No, I think it's a shame.
A lot of time with him. It's all people working around him. The one thing, and what happens is that you can't take the manuscript off site, and when he starts asking questions, he's running up against a lot of blockages. The bit that puts me off Pierce Brosnan in the film, to a degree, is we'll go on to subtext in a minute, because you're right about Bond. One bit of subtext is obviously he's a bit of a veiled Polanski himself, in that, and actually, funnily enough, at the end of the film we find out he's not actually directly So that's another thing that, did Polanski get drawn to this material as someone who feels unfairly maligned for something that was decades ago? He comes out at one point, they leave, and there's a load of protesters outside, along with his Secret Service detail and all the rest of it. And he actually talks to the press and protesters. And I don't know what the fuck Pierce Brosnan's thinking, because he's doing the worst Winston Churchill impression I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
That one scene.
Well, you see, life would be very dull if we didn't disagree. I mean, I think the thing is, and just to be clear again, when we're talking about Brosnan, we mean Brosnan's character was identifying with Polanski, not Brosnan himself, because Brosnan is basically doing what he's been instructed to do. He's a for-hire actor, and I think the thing is, one of the flaws with Pierce is that when he tries to give a more theatrical, emotive performance, it shows. He tries too hard.
Okay, I'm under siege. We need a bit of that, blitz spirit.
Yeah, and I think that's where it goes wrong. I think where Pierce excels, and I really do mean excel. I'm buying it, and I wish there was more of it in the film. To the extent that I would even have considered giving him some sort of an award nomination if I'd been on any kind of committee. There are moments where he sat down and he's talking to Ewan, and he does. He gets it wrong as Bond sometimes when he uses this technique, which is the laugh and the smile. But it works so well here. It has a moment of sinister, as in he's almost Bond villain like, where you don't know where it's going. But it's also self-deprecatory and nervous, and that to me captures the Blair character in a nutshell, or the thinly disguised take on Blair, which is that this is a guy who was intensely ambitious, but also wanted to still be the everyman, who was out of his league in some senses, but was the man who kept pushing to get out of that league and to go further. And Brosnan, in a split second, at least to some extent, captures the essence of that. And if we look at...
The critique on his run as Bond now is that he was just a pretty face.
Which is exactly the critique of Blair, isn't it?
Which is exactly... Well, they're saying he's just an actor in this film. Actually, what they're saying is he's... in fact... The critique on him as Bond is quite the opposite. There's a lack of substance, is what they're saying.
Yeah.
Also, if you look at Blair, it's always strongly felt that Cherie's the brains of the two.
Yeah.
I think Blair got like a 2-2 or something, and she got like a first.
Yeah.
She was a better lawyer than him when he was a lawyer. But there's definitely, this film obviously starts showing us that Olivia Williams is the brain behind the two of them. He's just a front with nothing under that front, but he doesn't know that because he's doing exactly what he thinks he's there to do.
Yeah.
He thinks he's a conviction politician. He thinks he's making all his decisions because the influences on him are subtle. It's just his wife in the ear, his pillow talk. So, and that's the same with his mom. He turned up, did what the part required, did what directors wanted of him, and now we're going, but there's nothing there. And it's the same with Blair. This idea that in years removed, people have forgotten the substance and just remembered the shell.
Yep.
And just gone out and he's only voted in as a pretty face, comparatively, in politician terms. There's some truth in that, because I don't ever believe Gordon Brown could have won an election. 2010, who knows? Had Iraq not happened, I don't know, because there comes a point where the popularity of a party can outstrip the leader. But it took a Blair type to win an election for Labour.
And it took a Brosnan type to bring back Bond to some extent. We weren't ready for a Craig Dalton type.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think all of that subtext is in the film. So when you look at the fact that it is an analogue for his tenure as Bond, it's an analogue for Blair, although he's not like Blair. What they've done very well is they've taken a flavour of it, in that it's the same broad timeline, in that we presume he was Prime Minister around the same time, and he's been out of office around the same length of time, and he was brought in as a good-looking, younger politician, comparatively, although Cameron ended up being the same age in real life. But there's hints of affairs, which certainly during Blair's time in office there never was. There's hints of highly illegal behaviour, whereas what Blair did was always out in the open. The argument of the legality of it is not that Blair did something really dodgy under the table, which is what the suggestion with Lang is. The suggestion is what Blair did in plain sight wasn't legal, if you know what I mean. And they're very different things.
Yeah.
So he's not a Blair analog, but he's an analog for the Blair era. He's an analog for the dynamic of the relationship between Blair and Shireen. He is an analog for Polanski's own personal issues, and he's an analog for Brosnan's time as Bond. And as that, for that reason, it's fascinating. The problem with the film is it sets it up, and he meets Lang, and Lang is like staggeringly ordinary, and he's also not a conviction politician. He wasn't born a conviction politician in the same way that Brown at university was doing politics, and Blair at university was, drinking and playing in bands. So that story, he was more of a conviction politician than we realise. He's played a little bit on the fact that he isn't, bizarrely. That's the thing. Another thing I find interesting, James, that you look at Blair, and it was always about trying to add gravitas to the man. Look at the 1997 manifesto. It's a close-up of a very serious-looking Tony Blair, not smiling and all the rest of it. Serious man for serious times. Actually, the implication in this film is quite the opposite. That he was a member of, let's say it was the Labour Party, I think it was, I don't know if the party's named, but let's assume it is. He was a member of the Labour Party before he admits it, in that he was a conviction politician, but he wants to play this, I did it for a girl. So in some respects, his preoccupations as a character are the absolute opposite of Blair's.
Yeah.
But now he's out of office, he's like, oh shit, I'm seen as like lightweight.
Yeah. It's interesting. So, worth a watch then, all four of them. All four of them worth a watch, do you think? All four. And your favourite of the lot is The Deal?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes. But that's a reflection on a few things. I mean, it's not the best without reservation in that, there are more, all of the other entries are much more cinematic. Obviously, the real prestige cast is in either the Queen or the Ghost. What I think me liking the first one is more about is the fact that it's much more about domestic politics that interests me more.
Yeah.
It's much more about an interpersonal dynamic that interests me more, although the special relationship tries to do that. And also there's just a subtlety in the writing that's not there in anything that follows, although nothing's as grandstanding as I feared it would be.
Yeah.
What I would say is do what I did, watch them all close together, particularly the Blair ones, because they feel like one big story then.
Yes. You there? Dave?
Yeah, I'm still here.
So, and in terms of Blair, the man, and the legacy, which I think, there may still be a chapter in that, because we don't have crystal balls. There are some who jokingly say, what if he came back?
Yeah.
Would people, obviously maybe...
He doesn't have the political capital to come back.
He wants to.
Still have a role. Well, it's whether he can still have a role in public life.
Yeah.
But I think he would have to do it. He would have to be the patronage for others.
Yeah.
Tony Blair couldn't win an election. Now he's toxic and it's run out of control. Now, if I was the mother or father of a boy who'd gone off at 18 and been killed in Iraq for something we shouldn't have been there for, then I am absolutely sure I'd feel differently. All I can say is I'm cognizant of all of that. I understand all of it, but I don't think he's the pantomime villain that's been painted. To listen to some people, he went out and stabbed David Kelly.
Yeah.
And cooked up a load of fake stuff, and I just don't believe that. I think Tony Blair's biggest problem, and it never really came out when he was in office, was that I think there's a part of him that thinks he's on a mission from God.
Yes, and like we say, and as we both agree, there is no question, and this is why he's been copied so much. For a split second, between sort of 94, 97, maybe all the way up, pushing it into kind of 2000. The country felt good about itself.
Even through the millennium.
Yeah, the country felt good.
Up to the fuel crisis, this guy could do fuck all wrong.
Yeah, the country felt good.
The Eccleston star could just bounce on him.
The country felt good about itself, and the legacy, if we ignore some of the specifics in terms of the ethos, is a country that, whatever the economic climate, whatever the change in mood, whatever the fears about a resurgent extreme right or extreme left, Brexit and so on, the fact of the matter is that the filter through which those events are now viewed is one of a desire for reconciliation, compassion, and alongside that, a genuine ambition for commercial and marketing success, which previous to that was missing. We caught up with the Americans to some extent on that, and I think we're still doing so. And to whatever way one looks at it, the man who was at the anchor of that was Tony Blair, and I think history, whatever way it judges him, will be of no doubt at an almost empirical, objective level that was the case. And I think we'll leave it there because we could just go on all night. I mean, he's a fascinating character and there's much more to discuss. I haven't decided on a franchise for next time, but given that it cropped up, I'm sorely tempted to subject you to some rom-coms and look at the political kind of subtext in some of those. But I know that's going to take some persuading.
Well, that's fine, because I can announce that. Do you expect us to talk Christmas commentary this year? Is Love Actually?
Oh, well, I've got to join that. I even pitched a sequel to that a decade ago. You've got to happen. It's going to happen. So, speaking of which, you're on the Star Wars retrospective at the moment. Where can we find you, Dave?
Okay, Star Wars actually recorded about 3 nights ago. It's edited now. It'll probably come out next week. We've just released a Cinematronics summer review. The reason being we had a delay in recording, so Chris and I sat down for 3.5 hours and talked through all the summer films. So that's just been released. Star Wars starts with Episode 4, the 1977 original, next week. You can find us at Expect Us to Talk on Twitter, facebook.com/Expect Us to Talk, or you can find me at the Plastic Kid 1976 on Twitter.
Dave, it's been emotional. Thank you very much indeed. To be continued. Have a great week.
Thank you very much.
God bless. Bye now.